The sun rises slowly over the Iraqi desert, casting long shadows across a landscape that seems, at first glance, empty. But emptiness here is an illusion. Beneath the sand and scattered stones lie the bones of cities older than memory, the foundations of temples where gods once received offerings, the archives where scribes recorded the first written words of human civilization. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And if you stand quietly in the early morning light, you can almost feel the weight of all those accumulated centuries pressing up through the earth. The Euphrates moves past with patient indifference, just as it has for millennia. Its waters are muddy, carrying silt from distant mountains to deposit across the flat alluvial plain. In ancient times, this silt was life itself, the fertile soil that made agriculture possible in an otherwise inhospitable land. The river's course has shifted over the centuries, leaving ancient cities stranded far from water, but the fundamental rhythm remains unchanged. Water flowing, sediment settling. The annual cycle of flood and retreat that dictated the entire structure of human life in this place. To understand Hammurabi and his empire, we must first understand how slowly this world took shape. Civilization did not arrive suddenly in Mesopotamia. It accumulated, layer by layer, like the silt from the rivers. The first farmers appeared here sometime around 10,000 BCE, in the long transition from the last ice age to the warmer, wetter conditions of the Holocene. They were experimenting, learning which plants could be cultivated, which animals domesticated. Their settlements were modest, a few mud brick houses clustered together, surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. Centuries passed, the settlements grew larger. By 6000 BCE, villages of hundreds of people dotted the landscape, connected by footpaths and simple trade routes. Pottery appeared, those first ceramic vessels shaped by hand and fired in open pits. The technology was crude by later standards, but it represented a fundamental shift, humans learning to transform raw materials through fire, to create containers that could store and transport food, to make permanent what had been temporary. The marshes of southern Mesopotamia were particularly rich in resources. Here, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread out into countless channels and wetlands before reaching the Persian Gulf, communities thrived on fish, waterfowl, and the abundant plant life. They built houses from reeds, those same reeds that still grow in the marshes today, weaving them into structures that could last for decades. They learned to navigate the waterways in small boats, made of bundled reeds coated with bitumen, a natural tar that seeped from the ground in certain places. Even then, thousands of years before Babylon, humans were learning to work with the materials this land provided. By 5000 BCE, something remarkable was happening. The villages were becoming towns. Eridu, later remembered as the first city, began as a small shrine beside a freshwater spring. Over centuries, the shrine grew into a temple, and around the temple, a settlement expanded. Other sites followed similar patterns. Uruk, Lagash. These were the first Sumerian cities, and they represented a new form of human organization. Populations numbered in the thousands, then tens of thousands. Specialized craftsmen emerged. Potters, metalworkers, weavers, people who no longer farmed but traded their skills for food grown by others. The invention of writing arrived sometime around 3200 BCE, initially as a tool for record keeping. Temple administrators needed to track offerings, distributions of grain, assignments of labor. They pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, using cut reeds, creating the script we now call cuneiform. The earliest tablets, are simple accounting documents, so many jars of oil, so many bushels of barley. But within a few centuries, the script had evolved to capture the full complexity of the Sumerian language. Myths were written down, king lists compiled, contracts formalized. The invention of writing meant that human knowledge could be preserved, transmitted, built upon across generations. The Sumerian city-states dominated southern Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. Each city was independent, ruled by a council of elders, and a priest-king who served the city's patron deity. The cities competed for resources, for control of irrigation canals, for prestige. Sometimes they fought wars, but more often they engaged in complex diplomatic negotiations, arranged marriages between ruling families, and traded goods across the growing network of routes that connected Mesopotamia to distant lands. In the north, different peoples were establishing their own centers of power. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language, distinct from Sumerian but equally ancient in the region. Around 2334 BCE, an Akkadian ruler named Sargon conquered the Sumerian cities and created the first true empire in human history, a single political entity spanning all of Mesopotamia. Sargon's empire was relatively short-lived, fragmenting after less than 2 centuries. But it established a template that would be repeated again and again. Unity was possible. One king could rule many cities. Diversity could exist within a larger framework. After Sargon's dynasty fell, there was a Sumerian revival, the third dynasty of around 2100 BCE, reunified much of Mesopotamia under Sumerian rule. This was a golden age of sorts, a time of impressive building projects, sophisticated literature, and bureaucratic efficiency. The kings of established an administrative system so thorough that thousands of their records survive, documenting everything from temple offerings to the management of textile workshops. But this unity, too, eventually fractured. By 2000 BCE, the Ur state had collapsed under pressure from Amorite migrations and internal instability. The Amorites were semi-nomadic peoples from the west, speaking another Semitic language related to Akkadian. They had been present in Mesopotamia for centuries, working as laborers, serving as soldiers, trading at the city gates. But around 2000 BCE, their presence became overwhelming. They settled in the cities, intermarried with urban populations, and gradually their leaders replaced the old ruling dynasties. This was not usually violent conquest, but a gradual transformation, a blending of cultures that created something new. By 1900 BCE, the political landscape of Mesopotamia had been completely reordered. The old Sumerian cultural heartland in the deep south had lost its preeminence. New centers of power emerged: Isin, Larsa, Babylon, Ishnuna, each ruled by Amorite dynasties, who nonetheless maintained Mesopotamian traditions, worshipped Mesopotamian gods, and wrote in cuneiform script. The cities competed constantly, forming and breaking alliances, expanding and contracting their territories in an endless cycle of ambition and setback. Babylon itself was not yet particularly important. It had been a city for centuries, mentioned in passing in earlier records, but it was neither large nor powerful compared to ancient centers like Ur or Uruk. Its location, however, was strategic, in central Mesopotamia, at a point where the Tigris and Euphrates come relatively close together, facilitating trade between north and south. The city's patron deity was Marduk, a god of limited significance in the wider pantheon, but that was about to change. Into this fragmented competitive world, around 1810 BCE, came a man named Sumu-Abum. He established himself as king of Babylon, founding what historians now call the First Dynasty of Babylon, or the Amorite dynasty. For the next century, his descendants ruled a modest kingdom, neither remarkably successful nor particularly threatened. They built temples, maintained canals, defended their territory, and engaged in the complex diplomacy that survival required. Generation followed generation. The kingdom neither expanded dramatically nor collapsed. It simply endured, waiting for the right moment and the right ruler. That ruler would be Hammurabi, but his story truly begins with understanding this deep background, the thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, the cycles of unity and fragmentation, the blending of cultures, the slow development of the tools and technologies that made civilization possible. Mesopotamia, in 1792 BCE, when Hammurabi came to power, was a land already ancient, carrying within it the memories of countless generations who had farmed these fields, worshipped in these temples, and recorded their lives in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. The landscape itself bears witness to this long history. Modern archaeology has revealed layer upon layer of occupation at every major site. At Uruk, excavators dug through 18 distinct levels of the Aena temple complex, each representing a rebuilding, a renovation, a continuation of sacred tradition. At Uruk, Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s uncovered the famous royal cemetery with its spectacular grave goods, but beneath that lay older levels still, reaching back to the city's founding. Everywhere, the pattern is the same. Cities built atop the ruins of earlier cities, temples rising on the foundations of previous temples, each generation adding its layer to the accumulating tell. This is the world into which Hammurabi was born, a world of deep tradition and constant change, of reverence for the past and ambition for the future. To understand his achievement, we must hold both aspects in mind: the weight of history that legitimized his rule, and the fluid, competitive environment that made his conquests possible. Mesopotamian civilization by 1800 BCE was neither young nor old, neither unified nor completely fragmented. It was mature, sophisticated, and waiting for someone who could harness its accumulated power and knowledge into a single vision. The rivers continued to flow, the farmers continued to plant and harvest, the scribes continued to press their marks into clay, and in Babylon, in the modest palace of a minor dynasty, a young prince was learning the arts of governance, studying the ancient texts, preparing himself for a reign that would transform his city from a regional power into the center of the known world. But that transformation would take time, patience, and a deep understanding of how power actually worked in this ancient land between the rivers. To understand the world Hammurabi inherited, we must wander slowly through the political landscape of early 2nd millennium Mesopotamia, a landscape crowded with kingdoms, each ambitious, each vulnerable. This was the Old Babylonian period, a time when no single power dominated, when alliances shifted like sand in the wind, and when survival required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. In the south, the ancient city of Larsa had emerged as a major power under the Amorite dynasty, established by Naplanum around 2025 BCE. By Hammurabi's time, Larsa controlled much of the old Sumerian heartland, Uruk, and the sacred city of Nippur, whose possession conveyed religious legitimacy throughout Mesopotamia. Rim-Sin I ruled Larsa from 1822 to 1763 BCE, an extraordinarily long reign that spanned most of Hammurabi's life. Rim-Sin was ambitious, capable, and deeply invested in maintaining Larsa's preeminence. He restored ancient temples, commissioned great building projects, and cultivated an image as the upholder of Mesopotamian tradition. To the east of Babylon lay the kingdom of Eshnona, controlling the Diyala River Valley and the trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau. Eshnona had its own law code, predating Hammurabi's by several decades, demonstrating the widespread concern among Old Babylonian rulers with establishing clear legal standards. The kingdom was prosperous, benefiting from trade in copper, tin, and lapis lazuli from the distant east. Its rulers styled themselves as equals to any other Mesopotamian king, and for much of the early Old Babylonian period, they probably were. To the north and west stretched the kingdom of Mari, perhaps the most fascinating of all Hammurabi's contemporaries. Mari controlled the middle Euphrates Valley, serving as a critical link between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world. The city itself was magnificent, with a palace complex covering nearly 6 acres, containing over 260 rooms arranged around courtyards. When French archaeologists excavated Mari in the 1930s, they discovered an archive of over 25,000 cuneiform tablets, diplomatic correspondence, administrative records, and literary texts that provide an unparalleled window into Old Babylonian political life. The Mari letters reveal a world of constant negotiation and intrigue. Kings wrote to each other with elaborate politeness, addressed each other as brother, and engaged in complex gift exchanges that reinforced alliances and signaled intentions. They maintained networks of spies and informants in rival capitals. They carefully calibrated every gesture, every word, knowing that a diplomatic misstep could mean war. Reading these letters today, we encounter real human voices across 4 millennia. Kings worried about grain supplies, queens managing palace households, generals reporting on troop movements, priests seeking divine guidance through divination. Mari's king during Hammurabi's rise was Zimri-Lim, who ruled from about 1775 to 1761 BCE. He and Hammurabi exchanged numerous letters, sometimes as allies, later as rivals. The tone of their correspondence shifted over the years, from warm cooperation to cool formality, to finally silence. When Hammurabi eventually conquered Mari, he destroyed it so thoroughly that the city never recovered, though whether this was motivated by political calculation or personal betrayal remains unclear. Further north lay Assyria, centered on the city of Ashur. In this period, Assyria was not yet the military empire it would become centuries later. Instead, it was primarily a commercial power, its merchants establishing trading colonies across Anatolia, exchanging Mesopotamian textiles for Anatolian tin and silver. The Assyrian kings of Hammurabi's era were relatively modest rulers, more concerned with protecting trade routes than territorial expansion. They rarely intervened in southern Mesopotamian politics, though they watched developments there carefully. Beyond these major kingdoms, numerous smaller city-states maintained precarious independence. Sippar, Kish, Maljium, Mankisim, and others, whose names survive mainly in ancient letters and king lists. Each had its own ruling dynasty, its own patron deity, its own ambitions. They formed the buffer zones between larger powers, sometimes playing rivals against each other to maintain autonomy, sometimes becoming pawns in larger conflicts. Their fates would be determined by forces beyond their control, by the shifting balance of power among the greater kingdoms. The political system of this era functioned through a complex web of alliances, typically formalized through treaty oaths sworn before the gods. A king might be allied with one power against another, but those alliances were rarely permanent. When circumstances changed, treaties could be abandoned, though this required careful management to avoid the appearance of oath-breaking, which carried both political and religious consequences. The gods were understood to punish perjurers, and a king's reputation for trustworthiness affected his ability to form future alliances. Military conflict in this era was not the massive imperial warfare of later periods. Armies were relatively small, perhaps a few thousand men at most, composed of the king's household troops supplemented by levies from subject cities and territories. Campaigns were seasonal, limited by agricultural cycles and the need to avoid extreme heat or cold. Sieges could last months or even years, with besieging forces trying to starve out defenders, while defending forces hoped for relief or negotiated surrender. Outright battles in open fields were relatively rare, as they were too risky. A single defeat could destroy a kingdom's military capacity. The archaeological record of this period reveals the material culture that supported these competing kingdoms. At virtually every major site, excavators have found administrative tablets from the Old Babylonian period, testifying to sophisticated bureaucratic systems. Temples received regular offerings, recorded in meticulous detail. Palaces maintained workshops, producing textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods. Merchants kept accounts of their transactions. The economy was complex, operating partly through barter, but also using silver as a standard of value, weighed out for large transactions. Cylinder seals. Those small engraved stone cylinders that served as signatures when rolled across clay documents survive in abundance from this era. Each seal was unique, carved with mythological scenes, patterns, or inscriptions identifying the owner. The artistic style of Old Babylonian seals is distinctive, more simplified than the elaborate seals of earlier periods, but still showing considerable skill. These small objects connected every layer of society. Scribes had them, merchants had them, even some slaves had them. They represent the pervasiveness of written documentation in Old Babylonian life. Religious life remained central to political legitimacy. Every king was understood to rule with divine approval, appointed by the gods to maintain justice and ensure proper worship. Royal inscriptions invariably begin by invoking divine authority. Building and rebuilding temples was a primary royal duty, demonstrating piety and bringing divine favor to the kingdom. The annual New Year festival, the Kitu, was particularly important, a time when the king underwent ritual purification and received renewed legitimacy from the city's patron god. The religious landscape itself was diverse and syncretic. The old Sumerian gods remained central. Enlil, the sky god; Enlil, lord of the storm; Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water; Inanna, goddess of love and war. But Amorite dynasties had also brought their own deities into the pantheon, and these were integrated rather than replacing older gods. The result was a rich, complex religious system where dozens of major deities and hundreds of minor ones received worship, each with specific functions, preferences, and temple homes. Nippur remained the most important religious center in Mesopotamia. Its patron deity was Enlil, king of the gods in traditional Sumerian theology. Whichever earthly king controlled Nippur and properly maintained Enlil's temple, the emperor, gained enormous prestige and legitimacy. Rim-Sin of Larsa held Nippur for decades, and this was a major source of his power. When Hammurabi eventually conquered it, he gained not just strategic territory but spiritual authority that helped legitimize his broader conquests. The scribal tradition of this period had developed sophisticated literary forms. Epic poems celebrating ancient heroes like Gilgamesh were copied and recopied, establishing a canonical version that would be transmitted for centuries. Wisdom literature offered ethical instruction. Hymns praised gods and kings. Mathematical texts solved complex problems. Medical texts prescribed treatments. The scribal schools, the Adobe, trained young men in this accumulated knowledge, creating a class of literate professionals who served in temples, palaces, and commercial enterprises. Women's roles in Old Babylonian society varied considerably by class. Elite women could own property, conduct business, and in some cases wield considerable influence. The Naditu women, a special class of priestesses, lived in cloisters attached to temples, managing substantial estates, and engaging in commercial lending. Lower-class women worked as weavers, brewers, and in other occupations. Marriage was contractual, with detailed agreements specifying dowries, bride prices, and responsibilities. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances, though heavily regulated. Slavery was common, but took multiple forms. War captives were enslaved. People who couldn't pay debts might sell themselves or family members into temporary servitude. Temple slaves performed menial labor for religious institutions. But slaves in Old Babylonian society had some legal protections. They could own property, conduct business, and under certain circumstances buy their freedom. The system was exploitative, but not as absolute as later forms of chattel slavery. This, then, was the world of the early second millennium BCE, a world of competing ambitions and shared culture, of diplomatic intrigue and commercial networks, of religious devotion and political calculation. It was a mature civilization, carrying forward thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and tradition, yet fragmented into dozens of competing political entities. No one power dominated. No unified empire imposed peace. Instead, kingdoms rose and fell in cycles, and skilled rulers could, through patience and opportunity, expand their influence. Into this competitive, sophisticated world came Hammurabi, inheriting a kingdom that was respectable but not preeminent, strategically located but not overwhelmingly powerful. His father Sinmabalit had ruled Babylon for 20 years, maintaining the kingdom's independence but not dramatically expanding it. When Hammurabi ascended the throne around 1792 BCE, at perhaps 20 years of age, he inherited a challenge shared by every Old Babylonian ruler: how to survive and ideally thrive in a world where every neighbor was a potential threat or opportunity, where today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy, and where power depended as much on wisdom and patience as on military strength. The stage was set, the actors were in place. The long drama of Hammurabi's reign was about to begin, though no one, including Hammurabi himself, could have predicted how dramatically it would reshape the political map of Mesopotamia. The year is 1792 BCE. In the palace at Babylon, a young man ascends to the throne. His name is Hammurabi, son of Sinmabalit, descendant of the Amorite dynasty that has ruled Babylon for nearly a century. He is perhaps 20 years old, though ancient sources do not record such details. What they do record are his actions, year by year, in the annual date formulas that mark the passage of time in Old Babylonian Mesopotamia. Each year, a king would choose an event by which that year would be known and dated. These year names provide a skeleton of Hammurabi's reign, a list of accomplishments both mundane and momentous. The first year of his rule is known simply as the year Hammurabi became king, a standard formula, revealing nothing of the young man's thoughts or ambitions, only the bare fact of succession. The second year is the year he established justice in the land, again a conventional formula, but one suggesting that he immediately sought to present himself as a just ruler, fulfilling the primary obligation of Mesopotamian kingship. Early in his reign, Hammurabi's year names focus on religious activities. Year 3, the year he made a throne for the sanctuary of Nana in Babylon. Year 5, the year he constructed the wall of the sacred precinct of Babylon. Year 7, the year he made a Shutamu throne for Ninmah. These are not the accomplishments of a conqueror, but of a pious administrator, a king who understands that power in Mesopotamia rests on divine favor, and that demonstrating piety through temple construction is essential to maintaining legitimacy. The physical reality of Babylon in these early years was modest compared to what it would become. The city covered perhaps 200 hectares, surrounded by walls, but not the massive fortifications that would later make it legendary. The Euphrates flowed through the city, dividing it into eastern and western quarters connected by bridges. The palace stood near the river, a complex of courtyards and administrative rooms, though nothing like the scale of Mari's Great Palace or the later Babylonian palaces that Nebuchadnezzar would build centuries after Hammurabi's death. The city's patron god, Marduk, had a temple called the Esagila, but in Hammurabi's early years, this was not yet the towering ziggurat that later dominated Babylon's skyline. That structure, the Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, would be built and rebuilt over centuries. In Hammurabi's time, the Esagila was important to Babylon, but not yet to Mesopotamia as a whole. Marduk remained a second-tier deity in the pantheon, respected in Babylon, but not worshipped widely elsewhere. This too would change, but gradually, as Babylon's political power grew. Hammurabi's early correspondence reveals a ruler deeply engaged in the minutiae of governance. One letter concerns the delivery of a leather bag for carrying tablets. Another discusses the quality of sesame oil sent as tribute. A third inquires about the health of an official's livestock. These may seem trivial matters, far removed from the grand sweep of empire, but they represent the actual work of kingship in this era, maintaining the complex systems of production, distribution, and obligation that held a kingdom together. The maintenance of irrigation canals was particularly crucial. Mesopotamian agriculture depended entirely on controlled flooding, on directing river water through canal systems to fields that would otherwise be desert. Canals silted up, requiring constant dredging. Levees needed repair after floods. Water rights had to be adjudicated when upstream users threatened downstream supplies. A king who neglected the canals would see harvests fail, leading to famine, unrest, and the loss of divine favor. Several of Hammurabi's early year names commemorate canal projects. The year he dug the canal Hammurabi Hagala, or the year he dug the canal Hammurabi Nuhushnishi, each marking the fulfillment of this fundamental royal duty. Legal administration also occupied much of Hammurabi's attention. Disputes arose constantly over property boundaries, inheritance rights, commercial contracts, personal injuries. The king served as the ultimate judge, though in practice most cases were handled by local officials or temple judges. But difficult cases, or those involving powerful individuals, might reach the royal court. The ability to dispense justice, to settle disputes fairly, was seen as evidence of divine wisdom. A just king brought order, an unjust king invited chaos. Diplomatically, young Hammurabi had to navigate carefully. His kingdom was neither strong enough to dominate neighbors nor weak enough to invite immediate conquest. He needed allies, but had to avoid becoming any ally's subordinate. The correspondence with Mari begins in these years, warm and respectful, with Hammurabi and Zimri-Lim addressing each other as equals, exchanging gifts, sharing intelligence about common enemies. Similar relationships were maintained with other powers: Eshnunna to the east, Larsa to the south, Assyria to the north. The threat from Elam, the kingdom east of Mesopotamia, in what is now southwestern Iran, loomed large in these years. Elamite armies had intervened in Mesopotamian affairs for centuries, sometimes conquering cities, sometimes acting as power brokers between rival Mesopotamian kings. Rimsin of Larsa had Elamite connections, which strengthened his position, but also made some Mesopotamian rulers wary of him. Hammurabi, in his early years, seems to have been part of a loose coalition aimed at limiting Elamite influence, though this alliance was informal and subject to change. Military activity in Hammurabi's early years was limited and mostly defensive. Year 11 is named the year Hammurabi the king, who provides abundance for Sippar, Larsa, and Babylon, raised the emblem of the gods Sin, Shamash, Ishtar, and Marduk by the power of his great army. This suggests a successful campaign, probably against a threat from the east, but is not described as conquest. The cities mentioned, Sippar, Larsa, and Babylon, were apparently allied or at least cooperating against a common threat. The archaeological evidence from Hammurabi's early reign is frustratingly sparse. Babylon itself has been difficult to excavate because the water table has risen over millennia, flooding the levels corresponding to the Old Babylonian period. What excavations have been possible were conducted mainly by German teams in the early 20th century, focusing on later periods. Our knowledge of Hammurabi's Babylon comes largely from texts rather than architecture, from what people wrote rather than what they built. Other contemporary sites provide context. At Mari, the palace archives include letters from Hammurabi's early reign. At Larsa, temple records continue uninterrupted, showing the kingdom's prosperity under Rimsin. At the famous ziggurat still stood as it had for centuries, a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nana. These structures, built by the kings of the III period 2 centuries earlier, still dominated the landscape, reminders of past glories and models for future ambitions. Daily life in Babylon during these years can be partially reconstructed from administrative texts and legal documents. The palace maintained workshops where craftsmen produced textiles, pottery, and metalwork. Scribes kept meticulous records of supplies issued and goods received. Temple complexes employed bakers, brewers, and other specialists to provide offerings for the gods. Merchants operated from houses near the city gates, receiving caravans from distant lands and organizing local distribution of imported goods. Houses in Babylon followed standard Mesopotamian patterns: rooms arranged around a central courtyard, flat roofs used for sleeping in hot weather, ovens for baking bread, storage jars sunk into floors. The wealthy had larger houses with more rooms, sometimes multiple courtyards, and decorated their walls with painted plaster. The poor lived in smaller structures, sometimes just 1 or 2 rooms, often sharing courtyards with other families. But even modest houses were constructed solidly, with mud brick walls plastered with bitumen for waterproofing, and floors of beaten earth or fired brick. The social hierarchy was clearly defined and carefully maintained. At the top stood the Awilu, the elite, the king, his family, high officials, wealthy merchants, major landowners. Below them were the Mushkinu, a middle class of palace dependents, lesser merchants, skilled craftsmen, and small farmers. At the bottom were the Warju, slaves, who might be war captives, debt slaves, or born into servitude. But even this hierarchy had complexities. A slave of the palace might have higher effective status than a free but poor farmer, and upward mobility was possible through commercial success, military service, or royal favor. Women of the elite classes could wield considerable influence. Hammurabi's mother, whose name has not survived, would have managed substantial household affairs in the palace. Elite women owned property, made contracts, and appeared in legal proceedings. The Nadatu women attached to Shamas's temple in Sippar formed a powerful economic bloc, managing agricultural estates and making loans. These women took vows of chastity, but were not cloistered. They engaged actively in commerce, while enjoying the protection and prestige of their religious status. The scribal profession required years of training. Boys, usually from elite families, would enter scribal schools in their early teens. They learned by copying standard texts repeatedly, gradually mastering the hundreds of cuneiform signs and the complex rules of Akkadian grammar. Advanced students copied literary texts, mathematical problems, and legal formulas. The best would enter royal or temple service as administrators, judges, or diplomats. Others might become private scribes, writing contracts and letters for the illiterate majority. Religious life permeated every aspect of existence. Each day began with prayers and offerings. Before any significant undertaking, divination was performed, examining sheep livers, observing bird flights, interpreting dreams. The gods were understood to communicate their will through signs, and reading those signs correctly could mean the difference between success and disaster. Hammurabi, like all Mesopotamian kings, consulted diviners regularly, seeking divine guidance for military campaigns, building projects, and political decisions. As the years of his early reign accumulated, 5, then 10, then 15, Hammurabi established himself as a capable and pious ruler. He maintained Babylon's independence, strengthened its defenses, ensured justice in his realm, and honored the gods through proper rituals and temple maintenance. But he had not yet distinguished himself from other competent Old Babylonian kings. His kingdom remained modest, one among many. His ambitions, if he had larger ones, remained hidden. The turning point would come in his 30th year on the throne, but that transformation was not sudden. It grew from all these years of patient administration, careful diplomacy, and gradual accumulation of resources and alliances. Hammurabi was learning, watching, waiting for the moment when opportunity and capability would align. That moment was approaching, though slowly, like the rising waters of the spring flood, inevitable but not yet overwhelming. For now, in these early decades, life in Babylon continued in its established rhythms. Farmers planted and harvested. Merchants traveled their routes. Scribes recorded transactions. Priests performed rituals. And in the palace, a young king handled the endless demands of governance, making decisions that seemed small at the time, but were slowly, year by year, building the foundation for empire. Before we follow Hammurabi's expansion across Mesopotamia, we must understand the landscape itself, the physical geography that shaped political possibility, that made certain cities wealthy and others vulnerable, that determined the flow of trade and the direction of armies. Mesopotamia is defined by its rivers, but it is the relationship between water, land, and human need that created the world. Hammurabi would come to dominate. The Tigris and Euphrates rise in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, where winter snows accumulate through cold months and then melt in spring, sending torrents of water southward. The Tigris is the faster, more unpredictable river, prone to sudden flooding, its waters cutting deeper into the landscape. The Euphrates is broader, slower, more manageable for irrigation and navigation. In northern Mesopotamia, the two rivers flow far apart, separated by hundreds of miles of steppe and cultivated land. As they flow south, they gradually converge, and in the deep south, they spread into a delta of countless channels before emptying into the Persian Gulf. This geography created distinct zones. The north received enough rainfall to support agriculture without irrigation, though irrigation still increased yields substantially. This was the land of Assyria, of Mari on the middle Euphrates, of rolling hills and relatively reliable harvests. The south received almost no rain. Agriculture there was entirely dependent on irrigation from the rivers. But southern soil, annually enriched by river silt, was extraordinarily fertile when properly watered. A single acre could produce far more grain in the south than in the north, making southern Mesopotamia, despite its environmental challenges, the wealthiest and most densely populated region. Water management was everything in the south. Canals had to be dug to bring river water to fields. Smaller channels distributed water from main canals. Levees prevented catastrophic flooding, but allowed controlled inundation, Drainage ditches removed excess water and salts that otherwise would accumulate in the soil. The entire system required constant maintenance and careful coordination. A dispute over water rights between two cities could escalate into war. A neglected canal could turn fertile land into desert within a generation. The major cities of southern Mesopotamia in Hammurabi's time were ancient even then, and near the Persian Gulf had been a major center for over 1,000 years. Its massive ziggurat, built by the kings of the Urda III dynasty around 2100 BCE, still dominated the landscape, rising in 3 stages to a height of over 70 feet. The ziggurat's mud brick core was clad in fired brick, with each brick stamped with the name of its builder, King Ur-Nammu. Around the ziggurat stood temples, palaces, and residential quarters where tens of thousands lived. Uruk, further inland but still in the deep south, was perhaps the oldest city of all. According to Sumerian tradition, Uruk had been founded by the gods themselves and was the city of the legendary king Gilgamesh. By Hammurabi's time, Uruk had been continuously inhabited for over 3,000 years. Its massive city walls, supposedly built by Gilgamesh, enclosed an area of over 2 square miles. The Inanna temple complex, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, covered dozens of acres, its buildings rising and falling through countless renovations over the millennia. Nippur held a unique position in Mesopotamian geography and politics. Located in central Mesopotamia, roughly equidistant from major power centers, Nippur was never a major political capital, but it was the religious center of Mesopotamia, home to the Akkad temple of Enlil, the king of the gods in Sumerian tradition. Whichever earthly king controlled Nippur and properly maintained Enlil's temple gained enormous religious legitimacy. Throughout Mesopotamian history, rival kings fought for control of Nippur, not for its wealth or strategic position, but for the spiritual authority its possession conveyed. North of Nippur lay Babylon, Hammurabi's capital. Babylon's location was strategic. It sat at a point where the Tigris and Euphrates came relatively close together, facilitating communication and trade between different regions. The city controlled crossings of the Euphrates, giving it leverage over north-south trade. It was far enough north to benefit from rain-fed agriculture in its hinterland, but far enough south to access the wealthy, irrigated farmlands of the deep south. This central position would prove crucial to Hammurabi's eventual dominance. Further north lay Sippar, an ancient city sacred to the sun god Shamash. Sippar straddled the Euphrates at an important ford, controlling traffic along the river. The city was famous for its Naditu women, priestesses of Shamash, who lived in a special cloister within the city, managing substantial estates and engaging in commercial lending. Thousands of tablets from Sippar's archive survive, providing detailed information about Old Babylonian economic life. To the east of the Tigris lay Eshnunna, capital of the kingdom of the same name, controlling the Diyala River Valley and the routes leading to the Iranian plateau. Eshnunna's wealth came from trade, copper from mines in the Zagros Mountains, tin from even further east, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley. Merchants in Eshnunna organized caravans that traveled for months across difficult terrain, exchanging Mesopotamian grain and textiles for metals and precious stones. The middle Euphrates was dominated by Mari, whose massive palace stood on a terrace above the river. Mari controlled the trade route, connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast, where Syrian cities like Ugarit and Byblos traded cedar wood, olive oil, and wine. Mari's merchants were active throughout the Near East, and its diplomatic correspondence shows contacts extending from Anatolia to Egypt. The city's location made it wealthy, but also vulnerable, positioned between major powers. It had to navigate carefully to maintain independence. North of Mari, the Euphrates Valley became progressively drier and more pastoral. This was the frontier zone, where sedentary agriculture gave way to pastoral nomadism, where Amorite tribal groups moved with their flocks between summer and winter pastures. These peoples were not outside the civilized world. They traded with cities, paid tribute to powerful kings, sometimes raided when kingdoms were weak, and gradually their leaders settled in cities and founded dynasties like Hammurabi's own. The Tigris Valley in the north was Assyrian territory. The city of Ashur, perched on cliffs above the Tigris, was both a religious center and a commercial hub. Assyrian merchants had established trading colonies in Anatolia, exchanging textiles and tin for silver and gold. These merchants kept detailed records, and thousands of their tablets, found at sites like Kanesh in central Turkey, reveal a sophisticated long-distance trade network, operating independently of royal control, financed by private capital and family partnerships. East of Mesopotamia, The Zagros Mountains formed a natural barrier, but not an impenetrable one. Numerous valleys led up into the highlands, and through these valleys flowed trade and occasionally armies. The kingdom of Elam, centered on the city of Susa, controlled many of these routes. Elamite culture was distinct from Mesopotamian. They spoke an unrelated language, worshipped different gods, and had their own artistic and administrative traditions. But Elam was deeply involved in Mesopotamian politics, sometimes conquering Mesopotamian cities, sometimes allied with Mesopotamian kingdoms against others. The trade routes that connected these cities carried not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Merchants traveled in caravans for protection, their donkeys loaded with textiles, grain, oil, and finished goods. They returned with metals, precious stones, timber from mountain forests, and exotic items from distant lands. Along with physical goods, they carried information, news of political developments, prices in distant markets, innovations in technology or administration. River transport was crucial where possible. Boats could carry far more cargo than pack animals, and the currents of the Euphrates aided downstream travel. Upstream journeys were more difficult, requiring boats to be poled or towed from the bank, but still more efficient than overland transport. Major cities had harbors and quays where boats could load and unload. Customs officials recorded cargo and collected taxes. Boat builders maintained fleets of rivercraft, from small reed boats to large wooden vessels capable of carrying many tons. The agricultural landscape that supported these cities was a patchwork of irrigated fields, date palm groves, and pastures for livestock. Barley was the staple crop, more salt-tolerant than wheat, and better suited to Mesopotamian conditions. Dates provided sugar and could be stored for long periods. Sesame yielded oil for cooking and lighting. Onions, leeks, chickpeas, and lentils added variety to the diet. Sheep and goats provided meat, milk, and wool. Cattle pulled plows and provided leather. The landscape also contained areas that could not be farmed. Salt flats where ancient irrigation had led to salinization. Marshes too wet for agriculture. Steppelands too dry without extensive irrigation. These marginal areas had their uses. Marshes provided fish, waterfowl, and reeds for construction. Steppelands offered seasonal pasture for flocks. But they also represented the limits of civilization, the spaces beyond intensive human control. This was the world Hammurabi knew intimately. Every major city, every important canal, every trade route. He understood that controlling Nippur meant religious legitimacy, that controlling and Uruk meant dominating southern wealth, that controlling Sippar meant access to northern trade, that eliminating Ishnona meant removing a commercial rival, that conquering Mari meant controlling access to the west. This geographical knowledge, accumulated over decades of diplomatic correspondence and commercial intelligence, would guide his strategy when the time for expansion came. But geography was not destiny. The physical landscape provided opportunities and constraints, but human decisions determined outcomes. Cities could be conquered, but had to be held. Trade routes could be controlled, but had to be defended. Canals could be built, but had to be maintained. The empire Hammurabi would create was not simply a matter of occupying territory. It required creating administrative systems, establishing legitimacy, managing diverse populations, and maintaining the complex infrastructure that made urban civilization possible in this challenging environment. The rivers continued their eternal flow from mountain to sea. The sun rose and set over ancient cities. Merchants traveled their routes, farmers tended their fields, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Mesopotamian civilization was preserved in libraries of clay tablets. This was the world waiting to be unified, if only someone had the vision, patience, and skill to do so. That someone was preparing, watching, learning, and when the moment came, he would act. Hammurabi's transformation, from a minor king to the master of Mesopotamia, was not a sudden explosion of conquest. It was gradual, calculated, and ruthlessly patient. For 30 years, he watched and waited, forming alliances, weakening rivals, accumulating resources, and military experience. And then, in the space of less than a decade, he systematically dismantled every major power in Mesopotamia. This is the story of that long, slow build-up, and its dramatic culmination. The turning point came in Hammurabi's 30th year on the throne, around 1763 BCE. The year name for that year reads, the year Hammurabi the king, the strong one who brings life to his city, the beloved of Marduk. Following the defeat of the army of Elam, who had gathered from the border of Markashi, the land of Sabatu, Gutium, Eshnunna, and Malgium, with the great power of the gods, established the foundation of Sumer and Akkad. by his might. This is not the modest piety of earlier year names. This commemorates a major victory, one that apparently involved a coalition of enemies from multiple directions. The details of this campaign are frustratingly vague. We know from various sources that Elam had formed an alliance with Eshnunna and other powers, apparently aimed at limiting Babylon's growing influence. Hammurabi, in response, formed his own coalition, possibly including Mari and Larsa. The battle, or series of battles, took place somewhere in the region between Babylon and Eshnunna. Hammurabi's forces won decisively, breaking Elamite power in Mesopotamia and severely weakening Eshnunna. This victory marked the beginning of Hammurabi's aggressive phase. In year 31, he conquered Larsa and finally bringing the wealthy south under his direct control. Rim-Sin, who had ruled Larsa for 60 years, was defeated and possibly killed. The conquest is described in multiple year names and royal inscriptions. Hammurabi presented it not as mere conquest, but as liberation. He was bringing justice to the south, ending Rim-Sin's allegedly oppressive rule, restoring proper worship in the ancient cities. The archaeological evidence from shows a destruction layer from this period, though not as severe as might be expected from a violent conquest. Perhaps Rim-Sin surrendered when resistance became futile. Perhaps Hammurabi, eager to present himself as the rightful ruler of Sumer, deliberately minimized destruction to ancient holy cities. Whatever the case, within 2 years, Hammurabi controlled not just but Uruk, Isin, and most of southern Mesopotamia. He now held Nippur, the religious capital, giving him the spiritual legitimacy he needed. The conquest of Eshnunna came next. Weakened by the earlier defeat of its Elamite allies, Eshnunna could not long resist Babylon's growing power. By year 33 or 34, Hammurabi's forces had occupied the Dailar Valley, bringing the eastern trade routes under Babylonian control. The conquest was thorough. Eshnunna ceased to exist as an independent kingdom and was absorbed completely into Hammurabi's empire. But the most dramatic conquest was yet to come. Zimri-Lim of Mari had been Hammurabi's ally, perhaps even friend. Their correspondence spans years, warm and respectful. But in year 35 of Hammurabi's reign, he turned on Mari. The campaign was swift and devastating. Mari fell, and Hammurabi's forces occupied the city. But 2 years later, for reasons that remain unclear, Hammurabi ordered Mari's complete destruction. The great palace was burned, its walls pulled down, the city so thoroughly demolished that it was never rebuilt. Why did Hammurabi destroy Mari so utterly? Some scholars suggest Zimri-Lim had plotted against him, betraying their alliance. Others propose that Mari's strategic position made it too dangerous to leave intact as a potential rival or rebellious province. Still others argue that the destruction was symbolic, a demonstration of overwhelming power meant to discourage future resistance elsewhere. The Mari letters, which had provided such rich detail about diplomatic relations, end abruptly with the city's fall. Zimri-Lim's fate is unknown. The destruction of Mari secured Hammurabi's northern and western frontiers. He now controlled the entire middle Euphrates Valley and the trade routes to Syria. In the north, Assyria maintained its independence, but kept carefully neutral, not challenging Babylonian power. To the east, the remnants of Elamite influence were pushed back into the Zagros highlands. In the south, the ancient Sumerian cities were firmly under Babylonian administration. By year 39 of his reign, Hammurabi could claim with justification to be king of Sumer and Akkad, the traditional title for a ruler of all southern Mesopotamia. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to Mari on the middle Euphrates, from the Zagros foothills to the edge of the Arabian desert. It was the largest unified realm in Mesopotamian history since the III dynasty. And unlike that earlier empire, Hammurabi's was more personally centered. He was not just king over kings but direct ruler, with local governors reporting to Babylon rather than maintaining independent dynasties. The military aspects of these conquests deserve examination, though evidence is limited. Mesopotamian warfare in this period involved relatively small professional armies, supplemented by levies. A major campaign might involve a few thousand troops, perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 at most. The core of the army consisted of the king's household troops, well-equipped, experienced soldiers who trained regularly and served year-round. These might number a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 men. Supplementing the professionals were troops supplied by subject cities and territories, their quotas determined by size and resources. These levies were farmers and craftsmen, called up for specific campaigns, armed with whatever weapons they possessed, receiving some training but nothing like professional standards. Their value lay in numbers rather than quality, useful for siege work, garrison duty, and intimidating enemies through sheer mass. Weapons technology had changed little in centuries. Bronze remained the metal for weapons and tools: spears, axes, daggers, and swords. Bows were composite, made of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together for power. Chariots, still relatively new technology, were present but not yet dominant. Most soldiers fought on foot, protected by leather armor and sometimes bronze helmets. Siege warfare involved building ramps to breach walls, undermining fortifications, or simply starving defenders into surrender. But wars were not won primarily by superior weapons or tactics. They were won by superior logistics, intelligence, and diplomacy. Hammurabi's success came from his ability to isolate enemies diplomatically before attacking them militarily. He formed alliances that allowed him to concentrate forces against one target while keeping others neutral. He gathered intelligence through merchants, diplomats, and spies. He struck when enemies were weakest, after harvest failures, internal disputes, or losses in other conflicts. The campaigns themselves typically followed seasonal patterns. Armies marched in spring or early summer, after planting but before the harvest. Campaigns lasting into autumn risked leaving fields unharvested, causing food shortages. Winter campaigns were rare, cold and rain made movement difficult, and soldiers needed to return home. The relatively short campaign season meant that major conquests often required multiple years, with armies advancing, besieging cities through summer, withdrawing for winter, and returning the next year. Hammurabi's personal role in these campaigns is unclear. Royal inscriptions always credited the king with victories, and year names were written as though Hammurabi personally commanded armies. But in practice, kings often delegated military command to trusted generals while remaining at the capital to manage administration. Hammurabi may have accompanied some campaigns, particularly major ones like the conquest of Larsa or Mari, but probably not all of them. What distinguished Hammurabi from other capable Old Babylonian rulers was not military genius, but strategic patience. He spent 3 decades building relationships, accumulating resources, and waiting for the right moment. When Elam overreached, forming an alliance against Babylon, Hammurabi was ready with counter-alliances and resources to defeat them. When Rimsin of Larsa was old and his kingdom vulnerable, Hammurabi struck. When Ishnana was weakened, he absorbed it. When Mari was isolated, he conquered it. The archaeological record of these conquests is mixed. At some sites, destruction layers mark Hammurabi's campaigns: burned buildings, collapsed walls, hoards of valuables, hastily buried and never recovered. At others, transition seems peaceful, with administrative tablets showing continuity of personnel and practices under new management. This suggests varied approaches: violence where necessary, accommodation where possible. The treatment of conquered populations appears to have been relatively mild by ancient standards. There are no records of mass deportations or massacres, except perhaps at Mari. Temples continued functioning, local officials often retained positions, and the primary change was that taxes and tribute now flowed to Babylon rather than to local palaces. Hammurabi presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful king restoring order and justice, a claim more plausible when conquest was not accompanied by wholesale destruction and slaughter. Religious policy played a crucial role in legitimizing conquests. Hammurabi commissioned stelae and building inscriptions throughout his empire, invariably beginning with invocations of the gods and descriptions of temple restorations. He presented himself as the chosen of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, but also as the faithful servant of other gods: Shamash in Sippar, Nana in Enlil in Nippur. By honoring local deities, he claimed continuity with previous rulers rather than foreign imposition. The elevation of Marduk to supremacy in the Mesopotamian pantheon was gradual. Initially, Marduk was important primarily in Babylon, but as Babylonian power expanded, Marduk's importance grew. Later tradition would claim that Marduk had always been king of the gods, but this was retrospective. In Hammurabi's time, the process was just beginning. Marduk was rising, but had not yet eclipsed older gods like Enlil, Shamash, or Sin. That transformation would be completed by later Babylonian dynasties. By the end of Hammurabi's 39th year on the throne, around 1754 BCE, the political map of Mesopotamia had been utterly transformed. Where there had been a dozen competing kingdoms, there was now one dominant power. Hammurabi ruled from the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates, from the Zagros foothills to the desert edge. Only Assyria in the far north maintained independence, and even Assyria acknowledged Babylonian preeminence. But conquest was only the beginning. The real challenge was creating an administrative structure that could hold this diverse empire together. establishing systems of taxation and justice that would seem legitimate to conquered populations, and maintaining the military and economic power necessary to discourage rebellion. This would occupy the remaining years of Hammurabi's reign, as he transformed from a conqueror into an administrator, from a warrior into a lawgiver. The empire had been won, now it had to be governed. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, standing in a gallery dedicated to ancient Near Eastern art, there is a stone stela that has captured imaginations for over a century. It is black diorite, polished smooth, standing over 7 feet tall. At the top, carved in relief, a bearded figure stands before a seated deity. The standing figure is Hammurabi, king of Babylon. The seated figure is Shamash, god of the sun and of justice, extending his hand to give Hammurabi the rod and ring, symbols of kingship and authority. Below this scene, covering the rest of the stone, are columns of cuneiform text, the Code of Hammurabi. The stela was discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists, excavating at Susa in southwestern Iran. It had been carried there as war booty, probably by Elamite raiders who conquered Babylon centuries after Hammurabi's death. 3 sections of text had been erased, presumably to inscribe the Elamite king's name, though this was never done. The stela's original location was likely the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, where it would have stood as a public monument, visible testimony to the king's commitment to justice. But the famous stela in Paris is not unique. Fragments of other copies have been found at various sites, suggesting that Hammurabi erected multiple versions of his law code throughout his empire. This was not meant to be a working legal document that judges would consult. Rather, it was monumental propaganda, a public statement of the king's values and achievements, designed to be impressive and permanent. The code was meant to last, to proclaim Hammurabi's wisdom and piety to future generations. The text begins with a lengthy prologue, establishing Hammurabi's legitimacy and piety. He lists the gods who have chosen him, the cities he has restored, the temples he has rebuilt. He describes himself as the shepherd called by Anal, beloved of Marduk, the one who brings abundance to Ur, the one who provides water for Sippar. The language is elaborate, formulaic, and deeply religious. Hammurabi claims his authority comes from the gods, and his primary duty is to ensure justice and proper worship. The laws themselves follow, traditionally numbered by modern scholars as 282 provisions, though the numbering is artificial and some sections are fragmentary or missing. The laws cover an enormous range of situations: property disputes, commercial contracts, family relationships, personal injuries, theft, slavery, agriculture, and more. They are not organized systematically by topic, but seem to follow a rough associative logic, with related cases grouped together. Perhaps the most famous provision is the principle of reciprocal justice. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If he breaks a man's bone, they shall break his bone. This principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, is actually applied selectively. It applies primarily to injuries between members of the Awilu class, the free elite. If an Awilu injures a Mushkinu, a member of the dependent middle class, the punishment is a fine rather than reciprocal injury. And if an Awilu injures a slave, the compensation goes to the slave's owner, not the slave. This class-based differentiation permeates the code. The same crime receives different punishments, depending on the social status of both perpetrator and victim.
If a physician successfully treats an Awilu, he receives 10 shekels of silver.
If the patient is a Mushkanu,
he receives 5 shekels.
If the patient is a slave, he receives 2 shekels. But if the physician causes a patient's death through negligence, the punishment also varies.
If the patient was an Awilu, the physician's hands are cut off. If a slave, the physician must replace the slave's value.
Family law receives extensive attention. Marriage is contractual, requiring a written agreement. Without a contract, a woman is not a wife. Adultery by a wife is punishable by death for both parties, though a husband can choose to spare his wife, in which case the male adulterer is also spared. A man can divorce his wife by declaring "you are not my wife," though he must return her dowry and, if there are children, provide maintenance. A woman can divorce her husband if she can prove he has mistreated her, though the standards of proof are demanding. Inheritance provisions are detailed and complex. Sons inherit equally, though the eldest might receive a preferential share. Daughters receive dowries at marriage rather than inheritance shares. If a man has children by both a wife and a slave concubine, he can legitimize the concubine's children by formal declaration, entitling them to shares. If he does not, the concubine and her children are freed at his death, but receive no inheritance. Adopted children have inheritance rights. though if they renounce their adoptive parents, they forfeit those rights. Property law establishes clear rules for ownership, lease, and transfer. If a man leases a field and doesn't cultivate it properly, he must pay the less of the expected yield. If a shepherd loses animals to predation or disease through negligence, he must compensate the owner. If a builder constructs a house badly and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder is executed. If the collapse kills the owner's son, the builder's son is executed, reciprocal justice extending even to family members. Commercial law governs loans, partnerships, and trading relationships. Interest rates are regulated, 20% per year for silver loans, 33% for grain loans. A merchant can loan seed grain to a farmer, receiving a share of the harvest. Tavern keepers, typically women, face severe penalties for overcharging or allowing conspirators to meet in their establishments. Prices for various services, doctors, boat builders, brickmakers, harvesters, are specified, creating a regulated economy where customary prices have legal force. The code's treatment of slavery reveals its fundamental assumptions. Slavery is ubiquitous and accepted as natural. But slaves are not entirely without legal protections. A man who seizes a free person and sells them into slavery is executed. A man who aids an escaped slave is executed, while one who captures and returns an escaped slave receives a reward. Slaves can own property, conduct business, and marry free persons, though their children's status is complicated. A slave who strikes a free person loses an ear, but an awili who strikes another man's slave must pay damages to the owner, not the slave. Women's legal status is complex and variable. Elite women could own property, conduct business, and appear in court. The Nadatu priestesses of Shamash at Sippar were particularly independent, managing substantial estates and making commercial loans. But women were generally under male authority of fathers, husbands, or brothers. A widow with young children might manage property on their behalf, but sons inherited when they came of age. A woman accused of adultery could clear herself by swearing an oath or undergoing the river ordeal, being thrown into the sacred river, with survival indicating divine vindication. The river ordeal appears several times in the code as a method of proof, when other evidence is lacking. If a man accuses his wife of adultery, but has no witnesses, she can clear herself by undergoing the ordeal. If she sinks, she is guilty. If she floats, she is innocent. This seems arbitrary to modern minds, but in Mesopotamian thought, the river itself was divine. The ordeal allowed the gods to reveal truth when humans could not determine it. What is notably absent from the code is as revealing as what is present. There are no provisions for treason, rebellion, or crimes against the state. Nothing about military obligations or service. No regulations governing temples or religious practices. These matters were handled through other channels, royal decrees, temple regulations, or unwritten customary law. The code focuses on civil disputes, economic relationships, and personal injuries, matters that might come before judges in regular proceedings. The code should not be understood as comprehensive legislation covering all legal situations. Rather, it appears to be a collection of representative cases, examples of Hammurabi's wisdom in adjudicating disputes. Many provisions begin, "if a man," and describe specific scenarios, followed by the proper resolution. This casuistic form, case law, rather than abstract principles, was typical of ancient Near Eastern legal thought. Justice emerged from accumulated precedents, rather than from philosophical reasoning about fundamental rights or ethics. How much did the Code of Hammurabi actually influence legal practice? This is debated. Thousands of legal documents survive from the Old Babylonian period. Contracts, court records, property transfers. Most contain no explicit reference to Hammurabi's code, and some actual verdicts differ from what the code prescribes. This suggests that the code was more ideological than practical, a statement of principles rather than a working legal manual. Judges relied primarily on customary law precedent and their own judgment, with Hammurabi's code serving as a prestigious reference, but not an absolute authority. Nevertheless, the code's existence was significant. It represented an attempt to establish public, predictable standards of justice. By carving the laws in stone and displaying them publicly, Hammurabi claimed that justice was not arbitrary, not merely the whim of powerful individuals, but based on established principles that applied consistently. This was propaganda, certainly, but propaganda with real meaning. It established expectations about what justice should be. The epilogue to the code emphasizes these themes. Hammurabi describes himself as the king of justice, who has established truth and justice throughout the land. He claims to have made the land comfortable, given it good governance, erected my precious image carved in stone, and inscribed my words upon it. He curses future rulers who might alter his laws or erase his name, calling down the wrath of the gods upon them. And he invites any oppressed person to come before his stela, have it read to them, and find guidance for their case. This invitation is poignant. Most people in Babylon were illiterate. The stela stood in the temple of Marduk, accessible but imposing. An illiterate farmer or tradesman, seeking justice, would need to bring a scribe to read the text. Whether this actually happened, we cannot know. But the image is powerful, the king's justice made permanent in stone, available to anyone who sought it, bearing the divine authority of Shamash himself. The Code of Hammurabi influenced later law codes. The Middle Assyrian laws, written several centuries later, show clear influence. The Hittite laws, from Anatolia, share the casuistic format. Even biblical law, particularly in Exodus and Deuteronomy, shows striking parallels. The lex talionis principle, specific case laws, similar concerns with property and family. Whether this influence was direct or represented common legal traditions across the ancient Near East remains debated, but the code clearly entered into a broader conversation about justice that would continue for millennia. In the modern world, the Code of Hammurabi has become iconic, though often misunderstood. It is cited as the first written law code, though earlier codes from Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar predate it by centuries. It is praised for establishing justice, though its class-based distinctions and harsh punishments offend modern sensibilities. It is held up as a model of ancient wisdom, though much of it seems brutally pragmatic, rather than philosophically sophisticated. What the code truly represents is an early attempt to systematize justice, to make explicit what had been implicit, to transform customary practices into public declarations. It shows a society sophisticated enough to think abstractly about justice, to recognize that power should be constrained by principles, and to attempt to establish those principles permanently. That these principles were limited, that they protected some while oppressing others, that they reflected a hierarchical and often brutal society. All this is true, but within their context, they represented progress, an attempt to create order and predictability in human relationships. The stone stela stands in the Louvre, drawing visitors who pause to photograph it, to read the translated text on nearby plaques, to gaze at the relief of Hammurabi receiving divine authority from Shamash. Most move on quickly, headed for more famous artworks. But for those who pause longer, who consider what this monument meant to the people who created it, who imagine it standing in ancient Babylon, proclaiming the king's justice, it remains powerful. A voice from 4 millennia past, still speaking about humanity's enduring struggle to create a just society. To understand Hammurabi's empire, we must descend from the realm of kings and laws to walk the streets of Babylon itself, to enter the houses where families lived, the workshops where craftsmen labored, the markets where merchants haggled. The grand sweep of conquest and legislation rested ultimately on the daily lives of thousands of ordinary people, each navigating their own small world within the larger framework the king had established. Morning in Babylon begins before dawn. The city gates remain closed until sunrise, guarded through the night by watchmen whose duty is to prevent unauthorized entry and exit. Inside the walls, families wake in houses built of mud brick, their roofs flat and used for sleeping in summer heat. In winter, people sleep indoors, huddled under wool blankets, the only heat coming from cooking fires that also serve to warm the space. There are no chimneys, smoke escapes through a hole in the roof or simply through the door. The first sounds are domestic. The grinding of grain, the most tedious of daily tasks, always assigned to women or slaves. 2 stones, the upper one rotated by hand over the lower, crush barley kernels into flour. It takes hours to prepare enough flour for a family's daily bread. The rhythmic scraping of stone on stone is background music to Babylonian mornings, a sound so ubiquitous that people cease to notice it, yet one that represents enormous labor, the hidden foundation of urban life. Bread is the staple food, supplemented by beer, which is nutritious and safer than water. Beer making is women's work, a household industry where barley is sprouted, dried, ground, and fermented in large jars. The result is thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic. People drink it through straws to avoid the sediment that settles at the bottom. Quality varies enormously. Fine beer for the wealthy, thin beer for the poor, with prices regulated by law to prevent tavern keepers from overcharging. As dawn breaks, the city gates open. Farmers from surrounding villages enter, carrying produce to sell in the markets: onions, leeks, dates, cucumbers, melons in season. Shepherds drive flocks through narrow streets to slaughter yards, where butchers will prepare meat for those who can afford it. Most people rarely eat meat, subsisting on bread, beer, porridge, and vegetables, with occasional fish from the river. Only the wealthy eat meat regularly, served at feasts that demonstrate generosity and maintain patron-client relationships. The streets of Babylon are narrow, winding between houses, unpaved except perhaps near major temples and the palace. In dry weather, dust rises with every footstep. In wet weather, mud accumulates, tracked into houses despite efforts to keep it out. Drainage is rudimentary. Wastewater flows into street channels and eventually to the river. The smell is constant: human waste, animal dung, rotting garbage, cooking fires, the pervasive odor of a pre-industrial city where thousands live in close quarters. Houses vary enormously by class. The wealthy live in substantial structures built around courtyards, with rooms for storage, servants, and guests. Walls are plastered smooth and sometimes painted. Floors might be paved with baked brick in the main rooms, though most are simply packed earth. The poor live in much smaller houses, often just one or two rooms opening onto shared courtyards, with minimal privacy and virtually no amenities. But even modest houses follow basic patterns: a street door leading to a small entrance room, then to the main living space, with the most important rooms furthest from the street for privacy and security. The day's work begins early. Craftsmen open workshops attached to their houses. Potters prepare clay, shaping vessels on wheels, turned by apprentices. Metalworkers heat bronze in crucibles, casting tools and weapons, hammering and finishing the cooled metal. Weavers sit at looms, creating the textiles that are Babylon's primary export commodity. These are not romantic craftsmen creating individual masterpieces, but workmen producing goods for trade, training apprentices in techniques passed down through families for generations. The palace and temples employ many specialists. Scribes report to palace offices, where they spend the day writing on clay tablets, recording receipts, composing correspondence, copying legal contracts, maintaining accounts. Their training was long and arduous, beginning in childhood, mastering hundreds of cuneiform signs and the complex grammar of Akkadian. A trained scribe could expect steady employment and reasonable compensation, though few became wealthy. The profession was respectable, offering opportunities for advancement through palace or temple administration. Temple complexes are cities within the city. The Asagula, Marduk's temple, employs hundreds. Priests perform daily rituals, washing the god statue, dressing it in fine clothing, presenting food offerings. The food once offered is redistributed to temple personnel as rations. Other temple workers maintain the complex, sweeping courtyards, repairing walls, managing the temple's estates. Still others engage in commercial activities. The temple acts as a bank, lending silver and grain at interest, managing agricultural lands, renting out properties. The markets fill in the morning, reaching peak activity by midday. Merchants sit in front of rented stalls, their goods displayed on mats. Prices are negotiated individually. There are no fixed price tags. A buyer offers what they think fair. The seller counters, they argue, sometimes walking away only to return. Eventually they agree, or the transaction fails. For large purchases, silver is weighed on scales, with the merchant and buyer both watching carefully to ensure accuracy. For small transactions, barter suffices: grain for oil, beer for bread, services for goods. Merchants form the backbone of Babylon's prosperity. The long-distance traders, the Tamkaru, organize caravans to distant lands, investing their own capital or borrowed funds in goods that will be traded for metals, precious stones, and exotic materials. These men are wealthy, respected, and well-connected, moving in the same social circles as palace officials and temple administrators. Their houses are substantial, their children well-educated, their daughters desirable marriage partners for ambitious scribes or younger sons of the elite. Women's lives vary enormously by class and circumstance. Elite women manage substantial households, overseeing servants, organizing food preparation, and maintaining family property. Some engage in business, particularly lending money at interest, an activity considered respectable for women of means. The Nadatu priestesses of Sippar represent a unique category: women who take vows of chastity but live independently, managing estates and engaging in commerce, protected by their religious status but not cloistered from the world. Lower-class women work as weavers, the most common female occupation after household labor. Textile production is essential to the economy, and women at looms in workshops produce the cloth that travels across trade routes. Tavern keepers are typically women, running establishments that sell beer and sometimes provide food and lodging. These businesses are regulated by law, with severe penalties for overcharging or watering beer. Other women work as bakers, midwives, or in service positions in wealthy households. Children are everywhere. In the streets, playing games, running errands, watching their parents work. Childhood is short. By age 7 or 8, most children are helping with household tasks or learning trades. Boys from elite families enter scribal schools, others apprentice to craftsmen, the poorest work as hired labor or tend animals. Girls learn household skills from their mothers, cooking, weaving, managing servants if the family has them. Arranged marriages typically occur soon after puberty, with detailed contracts specifying dowries, bride prices, and provisions for potential future contingencies. The afternoon brings heat, particularly in summer, when temperatures soar above 100 degrees. Work slows. Those who can retreat indoors or to shade. Some climb to rooftops, where breezes might bring relief. Water sellers move through the streets, carrying skins filled from the river, selling drinks to those who can afford them. The Euphrates is life itself, source of irrigation water, drinking water, despite its muddiness, transportation highway, and sacred boundary. The river is worshipped as divine, offerings made to its spirit, oaths sworn in its name. Evening brings revival. Cooking fires are lit as families prepare the main meal. The smell of baking bread, roasting fish, and boiling lentils fills the narrow streets. Families gather, eating together in courtyards when weather permits. Conversation flows, gossip about neighbors, discussion of work, complaints about taxes or officials, stories passed down through generations. This oral culture is rich despite literacy's limitations. Songs, proverbs, riddles, and tales preserve wisdom and entertainment, recited in homes and at communal gatherings. Religious observance punctuates the rhythms of daily life. Household shrines receive small offerings. Prayers are recited at morning and evening. The phases of the moon mark the passage of time, with monthly festivals that bring the whole city together. The annual New Year festival, the Akitu, is particularly important. 12 days of ritual, procession, and celebration, when the king undergoes ritual purification and renews his divine mandate. For ordinary people, it means a break from work, feasting, and the excitement of spectacle. Slavery is ubiquitous but varied in form. War captives work in the hardest positions, hauling stones for building projects, digging canals, laboring in fields. But many slaves are debt slaves, people who couldn't repay loans and entered servitude for a term of years. Others were born into slavery, inheriting their status. Treatment varies. Some masters are brutal, others relatively humane. A skilled slave might manage a workshop or conduct business on his master's behalf, living almost like a free person. An attractive female slave might become a concubine, her children potentially freed or even legitimized. The justice system touches ordinary lives regularly. Minor disputes over property boundaries, damaged goods, unpaid debts are handled by local judges or temple officials. More serious cases might reach the royal court. Witnesses are essential, as are written contracts. A person bringing suit must be able to prove their case through documentation or testimony. False accusation carries penalties, discouraging frivolous claims. The ordeal, throwing someone into the sacred river to determine guilt or innocence, is rare and reserved for cases where other evidence is lacking. Crime exists, but is probably less common than in later eras. The city is not densely populated by modern standards. Perhaps 30 to 40,000 people within the walls. Communities are small and interconnected. Everyone knows their neighbors. Strangers are noticed. Anonymity is difficult. This social cohesion, combined with harsh punishments, keeps crime manageable. Thieves caught stealing face severe penalties. Execution for major theft. Compensation for minor theft. Violence is punished reciprocally. The system is brutal but probably effective. Healthcare is rudimentary by modern standards, but sophisticated for its time. Physicians, the Asu, treat illness with herbs, surgery, and bandaging. They can set broken bones, lance boils, perform cataract surgery, and prescribe medications made from plants and minerals. Their success rate is impossible to determine, but some treatments were genuinely effective. Other healers, the Asipu, combine medicine with ritual, treating illness as demonic possession requiring exorcism and prayer. Most people probably consulted both types of practitioner, hedging their bets between physical and spiritual remedies. Divination is consulted before any major undertaking. Specialists examine sheep livers, interpret dreams, observe bird flights, note unusual events. The gods communicate through signs, and reading those signs correctly is crucial. A merchant planning a caravan, a farmer about to plant, a family arranging a marriage, all might consult diviners to ensure divine favor. This is not superstition in their view, but practical wisdom, an acknowledgement that success depends on forces beyond human control. As night falls, oil lamps are lit in those houses that can afford them. The poor simply sleep when darkness comes, conserving resources. The streets empty except for watchmen making their rounds, calling out the hours, ensuring that fires are extinguished and doors secured. The gates close at sunset, sealing the city until dawn. Above, stars wheel across the sky, observed by priests who track their movements, finding in celestial patterns messages from the gods about earthly affairs. This is the rhythm of life in Hammurabi's Babylon, repetitive, constrained by technology and custom, yet rich in human experience. The grand events we remember, conquests, law codes, temple dedications, rested on this foundation of ordinary lives, each person navigating their small sphere, bound by obligations to family, community, gods, and king. They were not so different from us, these ancient Babylonians. They loved and quarreled, worked and rested, hoped and feared, dreamed of better futures for their children. The details of their lives may be obscure, but the fundamentals of human experience remain recognizable across the millennia. Religion in Hammurabi's Mesopotamia was not a separate sphere from politics, economics, or daily life. It permeated everything, providing the framework through which people understood reality. The gods were real, present, and active in the world. They demanded service, rewarded piety, and punished neglect. And the king, ruling by divine mandate, stood at the intersection of the human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper worship and just governance. The Mesopotamian pantheon was vast and complex, with hundreds of deities arranged in hierarchical relationships that mirrored earthly society. At the top stood the great gods who controlled fundamental aspects of existence, and that the sky god was nominally supreme but largely distant from human affairs. Enlil, lord of the storm and king of the gods in Sumerian tradition, was more actively involved, though by Hammurabi's time his prominence was fading. Inti or Ea in Akkadian, god of wisdom and freshwater, was humanity's friend, the deity who warned in Epishtim of the coming flood in the Mesopotamian flood story. The astral deities were particularly important in Old Babylonian religion. Sin, the moon god, was worshipped at and Haran, his temples receiving lavish offerings. Shamash, the sun god, was the patron of justice and divine law. His temple at Sippar, one of the wealthiest in Mesopotamia. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, combined seemingly contradictory aspects. She was both the deity of sexual desire and the patron of warriors, both the morning and evening star. These contradictions didn't trouble Mesopotamian worshippers. Gods could be complex, containing multitudes. Each city had its patron deity, the god who protected and defined that city's identity. Yerd belonged to Sin, Uruk to Inanna, the Sumerian form of Ishtar, Nippur to Inal, Sippar to Shamash, and Babylon to Marduk. In Hammurabi's time, Marduk was still primarily a local deity, important in Babylon, but not yet dominant in the wider Mesopotamian world. His rise to supremacy would be gradual, accomplished as much through political as through theological means. The great temples were not just religious centers, but economic powerhouses. The Asagila in Babylon, the Akkad in Nippur, the Inanna in Uruk. These were massive complexes employing hundreds of people, owning vast agricultural estates, engaging in commerce and money lending. Temple revenues came from offerings, rents on temple lands, interest on loans, and royal grants. These resources supported not just priests, but the entire temple economy, administrators, scribes, artisans, laborers, and suppliers. Temple architecture expressed divine majesty through scale and elaboration. The ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid, was the most visible element, though not always the most sacred. The ziggurat at built centuries before Hammurabi, still impresses visitors today with its sheer mass, a mountain created by human labor, connecting earth to heaven. Each stage was smaller than the one below, rising to a small shrine at the summit where the god was believed to descend. But the main temple building, where daily rituals occurred, was even more important than the ziggurat. This structure, often called the Bit Ili, or House of the God, contained the inner sanctum where the deity's statue resided. Only high priests could enter this most sacred space, serving the god's needs as servants might serve a king. The deity was understood to actually inhabit the statue, which was therefore treated as a living being requiring daily care. The daily temple ritual followed an elaborate pattern. At dawn, priests entered the sanctum, singing hymns to wake the deity. They removed the god's night clothing, washed the statue with pure water, anointed it with fragrant oils, and dressed it in clean garments. Food offerings were presented: bread, beer, meat, fruit, arranged on tables before the divine image. Incense was burned, filling the sanctum with aromatic smoke. Throughout the day, offerings continued at prescribed times, with evening rituals closing the daily cycle. After being presented to the god, food offerings were redistributed. The deity consumed the spiritual essence, leaving the physical substance to be eaten by temple personnel. This system meant that temple employment included rations, a share of the offerings proportional to one's status and position. High priests received substantial portions. Lesser functionaries received less, but everyone connected to the temple participated in the divine bounty. Festivals punctuated the religious calendar, breaking the routine of daily rituals with special observances. Monthly festivals marked the new moon. Seasonal festivals celebrated planting and harvest. But the most important was the New Year festival, the Akkad, celebrated in spring, when the year began according to the Babylonian calendar. This festival lasted 12 days, and involved elaborate processions, theatrical representations of cosmic battles, and the ritual renewal of kingship. During the Akkad, the king underwent ritual humiliation and reinvestment with divine authority. He entered the Asagila and appeared before Marduk's statue. The high priest removed his royal insignia, crown, scepter, and ring, leaving the king temporarily powerless. The priest then struck the king's cheek and pulled his ears, forcing him to kneel. The king recited a negative confession, denying that he had neglected Babylon or allowed injustice. The priest then restored the royal insignia, and the king received renewed divine approval for another year of rule. This ritual is remarkable for what it reveals about Mesopotamian kingship. The king was powerful but not absolute. His authority came from the gods and required periodic renewal. He was accountable, at least ritually, for his governance. The ceremony enacted, in symbolic form, the possibility of divine withdrawal of favor, a powerful reminder that kings ruled by divine sufferance rather than inherent right. Marduk's elevation to supremacy in the Mesopotamian pantheon was linked to Babylon's political rise. As Babylon became the dominant power under Hammurabi, theological narratives adjusted to reflect this new reality. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, probably reached its final form in this period, or shortly after. It tells how Marduk defeated Tiamat, the primordial goddess of chaos, and created the world from her corpse. The other gods, grateful for Marduk's victory, proclaimed him king of the divine assembly. The political implications were clear. Just as Marduk became king of the gods, so Babylon became the legitimate ruler of the earthly realm. Just as Marduk brought order from chaos, so Hammurabi brought order to Mesopotamia. The myth legitimized conquest, transforming military and political success into cosmic necessity. This was not crude propaganda, but sophisticated theology, weaving political reality into sacred narrative in ways that made both more meaningful. Other gods didn't disappear when Marduk rose to supremacy. Instead, they were incorporated into his authority. When Marduk was said to possess the attributes of other gods, the wisdom of Ea, the strength of Ninurta, the justice of Shamash. By absorbing their characteristics, Marduk became a universal deity who could be worshipped throughout the empire without completely displacing local gods. This theological flexibility helped unify Hammurabi's diverse territories. Divination was essential to religious practice, the primary method for determining divine will. The most prestigious form was ex specie, examining the entrails, particularly the liver, of sacrificed sheep. Diviners, after long training, could interpret every mark, discoloration, and anomaly on the organ, finding in these signs messages about future events. Before any major undertaking, military campaigns, building projects, royal marriages, divination was performed to ensure divine approval. Dream interpretation was another important divinatory practice. Dreams were understood as communications from the gods, requiring skilled interpretation. Dream interpretation manuals survive, listing standard dream symbols and their meanings. Some dreams were straightforward. Dreaming of eating fine food predicted prosperity. Others were symbolic. Dreaming of flying might indicate success or danger, depending on other elements. Priests specialized in dream interpretation, and people who experienced particularly vivid dreams would consult them. Astronomical observation also provided divine messages. The movements of celestial bodies were meticulously recorded, and unusual phenomena, eclipses, comets, planetary conjunctions, were interpreted as omens. Priests kept detailed observational records, spanning centuries, noticing patterns, and using them to predict future celestial events. This proto-scientific observation was intertwined with religious interpretation. The heavens were where gods dwelt, and their movements revealed divine intentions. Magic, or more properly ritual expertise, was another aspect of religious life. The Ashipu, ritual specialists, performed exorcisms, removed curses, and protected individuals from demonic attack. Illness was often understood as demonic possession, requiring ritual rather than medical treatment. The Ashipu would diagnose the specific demon causing problems, then perform appropriate rituals, reciting incantations, burning specific herbs, creating protective amulets. This was not superstition to Mesopotamians, but practical knowledge about how spiritual forces operated. Personal religion existed alongside official temple worship. People wore amulets for protection, made offerings at household shrines, and invoked gods for help in daily affairs. Personal names often incorporated divine elements. Hammurabi itself means the kinsman is a healer, possibly referring to a god. Other common names included elements like Shamash or Sin or Marduk, expressing devotion or gratitude to specific deities. Women participated fully in religious life, though often in roles distinct from men. Female diviners and ritual specialists existed, though less commonly than male ones. Some cults were specifically female, with priestesses performing rituals that men could not. The Nadatu women of Sippar, taking vows of chastity but living independently, represented a unique female religious role that provided alternatives to marriage while maintaining respectability. The relationship between gods and humans was fundamentally reciprocal. Humans provided the gods with offerings, maintaining temples and performing rituals. In return, the gods provided protection, prosperity, and order. This was not primarily a relationship of love, though affection between devotee and deity could develop, but of mutual obligation. The gods needed human service. Humans needed divine favor. Both parties benefited from maintaining proper relationship. When disasters occurred, floods, droughts, epidemics, military defeats, they were understood as divine punishment for some failure in worship or justice. The proper response was not to question the gods, but to determine what offense had been committed and make appropriate amends. Hammurabi's presentation of himself as the just king, ensuring proper worship and justice throughout the land, was designed to prevent such divine anger and maintain cosmic order. The afterlife received surprisingly little emphasis in Mesopotamian religion. The dead went to the netherworld, a gloomy place beneath the earth, where they existed as shadows, eating dust and dwelling in darkness. No amount of piety could change this fate. There was no heaven for the righteous, no special reward for virtue. The goal was not a blessed afterlife, but a good life on earth, with perhaps the comfort of being remembered by descendants, who would provide offerings at one's tomb. This focus on earthly life rather than heavenly reward gave Mesopotamian religion a pragmatic quality. The goal was prosperity, health, numerous descendants, and a respected place in society. Religion served these ends, providing frameworks for understanding success and failure, rituals for managing anxiety and uncertainty, and communities of shared belief that reinforce social bonds. By promoting Marduk, funding temples throughout his empire, and presenting himself as the divinely chosen king of justice, Hammurabi created a religious framework that legitimized and sustained his political power. The temples were not separate from the state but integral to it, their personnel part of the administrative apparatus, their economic resources available for royal projects. Religion and politics were inseparable, each reinforcing the other, both serving to maintain the cosmic order that Hammurabi claimed to have established. Behind every empire lies a less dramatic but equally essential story. The story of how information flows, how resources are extracted and distributed, how decisions are made and enforced across hundreds of miles and thousands of people. Hammurabi's empire was not held together primarily by military might, though force was available when needed. It was held together by an administrative system of remarkable sophistication, documented in thousands of clay tablets that still survive, waiting to tell their story. At the heart of this system was writing itself. Cuneiform, pressed into clay with a cut reed, was a technology that made complex administration possible. Without writing, a king could rule only what he could personally oversee, could remember only what human memory could retain. Writing allowed information to transcend time and space, to be stored, retrieved, compared, and analyzed. The archives of Hammurabi's palace were institutional memory, repositories of contracts, correspondence, legal precedents, and administrative records, stretching back decades. Every significant transaction was recorded. When the palace issued rations to workers, a tablet documented who received what amount. When taxes were collected from a city, a tablet recorded the amount and the collector. When a merchant borrowed silver to finance a trading expedition, a contract tablet specified terms, witnesses, and penalties for default. These tablets were stored systematically, organized in ways that allowed retrieval when needed. Some bore identifying tags, small clay labels indicating contents. Others were stored in jars or baskets, grouped by type or date. The physical act of creating these tablets was routine but required skill. Scribes worked with fresh clay, shaped into rectangles or rounded tablets, depending on purpose and local custom. While the clay was still soft, they pressed cuneiform signs into the surface using a stylus. The text was arranged in columns, read from left to right and top to bottom. When the text was complete, the tablet was left to dry in the sun, hardening into a permanent record. For particularly important documents, tablets might be fired in kilns, making them even more durable. Seals authenticated documents and indicated authority. Cylinder seals, small stone cylinders, carved with distinctive images and inscriptions, were rolled across soft clay to leave an impression. Each seal was unique, serving as a signature. Important officials had seals designating their positions. Merchants had personal seals for business transactions. Even some slaves and dependents had seals for conducting authorized business. The seal impressions on a tablet indicated who was responsible for its contents and vouched for its authenticity. The palace bureaucracy was hierarchical and specialized. At the top stood the king, who made major decisions and issued general policy directives. Below him were senior officials with broad responsibilities. The vizier, or chief minister, the chief judge, the commander of military forces, the overseer of public works. These men were typically from elite families, educated as scribes, with decades of experience in palace administration. They advised the king, coordinated between different branches of government, and oversaw complex operations. Below the senior officials were specialized departments, each with its own hierarchy of personnel. The Treasury Department managed royal revenues, taxes, tribute, confiscated property, profits from royal estates. Treasury officials tracked income and expenditure, releasing funds for authorized purposes, maintaining reserves against future needs. Their work was detailed and precise, with every transaction recorded and periodically audited by senior officials. The Public Works Department organized major construction projects: canal digging, wall building, temple construction. These projects required coordinating thousands of workers, ensuring adequate supplies of food and tools, and overseeing actual construction to ensure quality. Workers might be corvée laborers, ordinary citizens required to provide labor service for a certain number of days per year, or specialized craftsmen employed directly by the palace. The organization of such large-scale projects was a major administrative challenge, requiring careful planning and constant supervision. Military administration was another specialized function. The palace maintained records of soldiers, their equipment, their assignments, and their service records. When campaigns were launched, officials assembled armies from various sources: professional palace troops, levies from subject cities, and sometimes mercenaries hired for specific purposes. Supplying these forces required logistical planning, calculating food requirements, organizing transport, establishing supply depots along routes of march. The difference between success and failure often came down to administrative competence rather than battlefield bravery. Local administration varied depending on a region's history and circumstances. Some cities had traditional ruling dynasties that Hammurabi left in place, though requiring tribute and obedience to royal directives. Other cities received governors appointed from Babylon, usually trusted officials or relatives of the king. These governors had considerable autonomy in local affairs, but were expected to maintain order, collect taxes, and enforce royal decrees. They reported regularly to Babylon, sending tablets describing local conditions, problems requiring royal attention, and opportunities for royal exploitation. The year name system itself was an administrative tool. Each year was designated by a significant event: a canal dug, a temple built, a city conquered. These year names appeared on all dated documents, allowing contracts and records to be placed in chronological sequence. The system required coordination throughout the empire. Scribes everywhere had to know the current year name and use it consistently. Lists of year names were maintained and copied, providing historical records of royal achievements, while also serving practical administrative purposes. Communication across the empire relied on messengers, men who traveled regularly between Babylon and outlying cities, carrying sealed tablets with royal orders, reports from governors, legal appeals, and commercial correspondence. These messengers followed established routes, staying at waypoints where they could rest and obtain fresh supplies. The system was reasonably efficient but not fast by modern standards. Messages might take days or weeks to reach distant destinations, and responses took equal time returning. This communication lag meant that local officials needed authority to make decisions independently, acting on general policy directives, rather than specific instructions for every situation. Taxation provided the revenue that funded all government operations. Several forms of taxation existed. Agricultural taxes were typically a percentage of harvest, collected in kind, barley, dates, oil, and stored in palace granaries. Commercial taxes were levied on trade transactions, again typically in kind or in silver. Tribute from conquered cities was another revenue source, essentially a tax imposed on defeated enemies. Corvée, labor, was a form of taxation in service rather than goods, requiring citizens to provide work on public projects. Tax collection was complex and provided opportunities for corruption. Local officials might collect more than required, keeping the difference. They might exempt favored individuals in exchange for bribes. They might claim that harvests were poor when they were actually good, reducing what they owed the palace. Royal inspectors periodically audited local administration, checking records against reported revenues, but the system was imperfect. Some level of local corruption was probably tolerated as long as adequate revenues reached Babylon and local order was maintained. Justice administration was decentralized. Most legal disputes were handled locally by city judges or temple officials. Only particularly complex cases, or those involving powerful individuals, reached the royal court in Babylon. But Hammurabi maintained the fiction of personal involvement in justice, presenting himself as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. His law code, displayed publicly, established standards that local judges were expected to follow, though in practice they relied primarily on customary law and precedent. Legal proceedings required documentation. Contracts were written, specifying terms and witnessed by multiple parties. Court decisions were recorded, with judges explaining their reasoning. Property transfers were documented, creating paper trails that could be consulted in future disputes. This emphasis on written records meant that literacy was essential for full participation in the legal system, though illiterate individuals could hire scribes to represent their interests. Commercial administration involved the palace only indirectly. Most trade was conducted by private merchants operating on their own capital or borrowed funds. But the palace had interests in certain commodities, particularly those involving strategic materials like metals and timber. The palace sometimes organized expeditions to obtain needed goods, or granted monopolies to favored merchants in exchange for a share of profits. The boundaries between public and private enterprise were fluid, with individuals moving between palace service and private commerce. Archives were maintained not just in Babylon, but in major provincial centers. When excavators uncovered the palace at Mari, they found over 25,000 tablets, many dealing with routine administrative matters, but others providing insights into diplomatic and military affairs. Similar archives probably existed at Lhasa, Sippar, and other major cities, though most have not survived or have not yet been found. These provincial archives allowed local administration to function independently, while providing documentation that could be audited by central authorities. The administrative system was not static, but evolved based on experience and changing circumstances. When problems arose, new procedures were developed. When certain types of disputes became common, standardized solutions were established. When tax collection proved difficult in certain areas, different methods were tried. This adaptability, combined with the fundamental technology of written record keeping, allowed the system to function across diverse territories with varying traditions and circumstances. Education of future administrators began in childhood. Boys from elite families entered scribal schools, the Eduba, typically attached to temples or palaces. They spent years learning cuneiform script, studying model texts, practicing composition and calculation. The curriculum included not just writing but mathematics, essential for accounting and engineering projects. Students copied literary texts, absorbing cultural traditions along with practical skills. The best students entered palace service. Others might become temple scribes, merchant scribes, or teachers training the next generation. Women were largely excluded from formal scribal training and palace administration, though wealthy women might employ scribes to manage their affairs. The Nadatu priestesses of Sippar were an exception, managing substantial estates and conducting business, though they too probably employed male scribes for actual document preparation. This gender division meant that half the population's talents were largely unused in formal administration, though women's informal influence through family networks and household management should not be underestimated. The administrative machine functioned most of the time, though not perfectly. Documents were lost or misfiled. Instructions were misunderstood or ignored. Corruption diverted resources. Incompetent officials bungled their duties. But the system was robust enough to tolerate these failures and continue functioning. The sheer volume of documentation, the redundancy of multiple copies and cross-references, the hierarchy of officials checking on subordinates, all these features made the system resilient. When Hammurabi died, this administrative apparatus continued operating under his successors. The systems he had established, the networks of officials he had appointed, the procedures that had become routine, all these outlasted him. This continuity was perhaps his greatest achievement, more enduring than his military conquests. He had created an empire, but more importantly, he had created the mechanisms that allowed an empire to function, transforming conquest into governance, power into administration, military victory into sustainable order. Section 9. Word count. Approximately 1,800 words. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, after ruling for 43 years. He was succeeded by his son Samsu-iluna, who inherited an empire at its height, but would spend much of his reign fighting to preserve what his father had built. The transition seemed smooth initially. The administrative apparatus continued functioning, tribute continued arriving from subject territories, and the palace bureaucracy served the new king as it had served the old. But beneath this surface continuity, problems were accumulating. The sources for Samsu-iluna's reign are far less abundant than for Hammurabi's, but what survives tells a story of gradual erosion. In the south, rebellion broke out within a few years of Hammurabi's death. A man named Rim-Sin II, possibly claiming descent from the earlier king of Larsa, established an independent kingdom in the old Sumerian heartland. Samsu-iluna campaigned against him repeatedly, eventually defeating him, but at enormous cost. Several year names from Samsu-iluna's reign commemorate victories over Rim-Sin and the destruction of rebellious cities. These southern campaigns devastated the region. Archaeological surveys show a dramatic decline in settlement in southern Mesopotamia, beginning in the mid-18th century BCE. Sites that had been continuously occupied for millennia were abandoned. Irrigation systems, neglected during the warfare, began to fail. Salt accumulated in fields that were once productive. The economic heart of Mesopotamia, the wealthy cities of the Deep South, entered a long decline from which they would not recover for centuries. Why did the South collapse so dramatically? Military destruction was part of the answer, but not all. The irrigation systems that made southern Mesopotamia prosperous required constant maintenance and careful management. These systems had been strained for centuries, with salinization gradually reducing productivity. During Hammurabi's conquests and the subsequent rebellions, maintenance was neglected. Canals silted up, levees broke. Once irrigation systems failed, they were difficult and expensive to restore. Communities dependent on those systems either moved away or died out. Political fragmentation compounded economic decline. As Babylon's control weakened, local strongmen established independent power bases. Imad. Instead of a unified administration managing water resources across wide areas, competing authorities pursued narrow interests. Upstream users took water without regard for downstream needs. Disputes that unified authority might have arbitrated festered into armed conflicts. The tragedy of the commons played out on a regional scale, with shared resources destroyed through competitive exploitation. The Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains to the east, began infiltrating Mesopotamia. During this period, they were not initially conquerors, but migrants, seeking opportunities in a weakened land. Some served as mercenaries in Babylonian armies, others settled in depopulated areas. Over generations, they gradually accumulated power until, by the mid-16th century BCE, a Kassite dynasty had replaced Hammurabi's line on the Babylonian throne. But this was not sudden conquest. It was gradual infiltration and assimilation, a slow transformation, rather than dramatic overthrow. The Kassites adopted Babylonian culture extensively. They wrote in Akkadian, worshipped Babylonian gods, maintained Babylonian administrative practices. They saw themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as legitimate heirs to Mesopotamian tradition. Under Kassite rule, Babylon would experience a cultural revival, though the old Sumerian south never recovered its former prosperity. The center of power shifted northward permanently, where irrigation was less critical and agriculture more sustainable. During the Kassite period, which lasted over 4 centuries, Hammurabi's legacy was preserved and transformed. The Code of Hammurabi was copied and studied. Later law codes drew on its provisions. Hammurabi himself was remembered as a model king, a lawgiver whose wisdom had established justice. The historical reality, a capable but ambitious conqueror who happened to compile existing legal traditions, was gradually replaced by a more idealized image. The elevation of Marduk to supremacy in the Mesopotamian pantheon continued under the Kassites. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, celebrating Marduk's victory over chaos, probably reached its final form in this period. The Esagila Marduk's temple was rebuilt and expanded. Marduk became not just Babylon's patron, but the chief deity of Mesopotamia, his primacy reflecting Babylon's cultural if not always political preeminence. Beyond Mesopotamia, the Late Bronze Age was a time of internationalism.
Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia,
And Kassite Babylon maintained diplomatic relations, exchanging letters, arranging royal marriages, and trading luxury goods. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt, show Kassite kings corresponding with Egyptian pharaohs as equals, exchanging gifts and discussing political matters. Babylon remained important, though no longer dominant. This internationalism ended catastrophically around 1200 BCE. A series of interconnected disasters, invasions, crop failures, earthquakes, social upheavals, destroyed most Bronze Age civilizations within a few decades. The Hittite Empire collapsed completely. Mycenaean Greece was devastated. Egypt survived, but greatly weakened. The complex trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world disintegrated. Literacy nearly disappeared in some regions. The period that followed is sometimes called a Dark Age, though recent scholarship has emphasized continuities alongside the dramatic changes. Kassite Babylon survived this collapse better than most Bronze Age states, perhaps because it was further from the Mediterranean centers of disruption. But it too eventually fell, conquered by Elamites. Around 1155 BCE, the Elamites carried away immense booty, including the stela containing Hammurabi's law code, which is why it was eventually found at Susa, rather than in Babylon. But the Elamite conquest was relatively brief. New dynasties arose, and Babylon continued, though diminished from its earlier glory. The centuries following 1200 BCE saw the rise of new powers. The Assyrian Empire, centered in northern Mesopotamia, gradually expanded to dominate the entire region and beyond. The Assyrians were brilliant military organizers and ruthless conquerors, creating an empire far larger than Hammurabi's. But even the Assyrians acknowledged Babylon's cultural primacy. They maintained Babylon's temples, respected its traditions, and claimed to be protecting rather than dominating the ancient city. When the Assyrian Empire finally collapsed in the late 7th century BCE, Babylon experienced a final flowering under the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. Nebuchadnezzar II, ruling from 605 to 562 BCE, transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city in the ancient world. He built the famous Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though some scholars now question whether these gardens were actually in Babylon. He rebuilt the Ishtar Gate, with brilliant blue glazed bricks decorated with bulls and dragons. He constructed a massive ziggurat, the Etam and Anki, which may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. This Neo-Babylonian glory was brief. Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BCE, conquered by Cyrus the Great, without significant resistance. The Persians treated Babylon well, maintaining its temples and respecting its traditions. Babylon became a provincial capital of the vast Persian Empire, important but no longer independent. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 BCE, he too respected Babylon, planning to make it his capital before his untimely death. But Babylon's age was ending. Alexander's successors built new cities. Seleucia on the Tigris, not far from Babylon, became the new regional capital. Population gradually shifted away from Babylon to newer urban centers. The old city declined, though slowly. Temples continued functioning into the Parthian period, receiving offerings and maintaining rituals. The last dated cuneiform tablet from Babylon was written in 75 CE, over 1,800 years after Hammurabi's death, testament to the extraordinary longevity of Mesopotamian literate culture. Eventually, Babylon was abandoned completely. Its mud brick buildings, no longer maintained, eroded in rain and wind, sand accumulated in its streets. The ruins became a source of bricks for building projects elsewhere. By medieval times, only massive mounds remained, and even the memory of what they represented had faded. Local Arabs called the site Babil, preserving a distorted form of the ancient name, but they no longer knew its history. Yet Hammurabi's legacy persisted in unexpected ways. His law code, though buried for millennia, had influenced subsequent Mesopotamian legal traditions, which in turn influenced biblical law. The Code of Hammurabi contains striking parallels to biblical law codes in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Whether this influence was direct or mediated through common ancient Near Eastern legal traditions remains debated, but the connections are undeniable. The administrative practices Hammurabi refined, centralized bureaucracy, written documentation, hierarchical organization, became templates for subsequent empires. The Assyrians, Persians, and later the Romans all used similar systems. The fundamental insight that empire requires more than military conquest, that it requires administrative structures to hold territory and extract resources. This insight, demonstrated by Hammurabi's success and his successors' struggles, would shape imperial governance for millennia. The religious transformation Hammurabi began, elevating his city's god to supremacy, while incorporating rather than displacing local deities, also had long-term influence. This model of religious incorporation would be used by later empires, allowing diverse peoples to be governed while maintaining their distinct identities within larger frameworks. The Persians, particularly, would perfect this approach, creating an empire more diverse and lasting than any previous Mesopotamian state. Perhaps most fundamentally, Hammurabi represented an ideal of just kingship that persisted long after his death. The king who establishes law, who ensures justice, who maintains order. This image shaped how subsequent rulers presented themselves and how subjects evaluated them. The law code, whatever its practical limitations, established a principle that power should be constrained by public standards, that rulers are accountable for justice, that the strong should not simply exploit the weak. These ideals were often violated in practice. Ancient empires could be brutal, exploitative, and unjust. But the ideals persisted nonetheless, providing standards against which actual behavior could be measured, creating spaces for criticism and accountability. The distance between ideal and reality was often vast, but the existence of publicly proclaimed ideals mattered, creating at least the possibility of calling power to account. In this sense, Hammurabi's truest legacy may not be territorial conquests that quickly dissolved, nor even specific legal provisions now outdated, but rather the demonstration that civilization requires more than force, that power needs legitimacy, and that justice, however imperfectly realized, remains a fundamental human aspiration. These insights, first articulated clearly in Hammurabi's Babylon, remain relevant today, over 4 millennia later, as we continue to wrestle with questions of power, justice, and governance. Section 10, Word Count. Approximately 1,850 words. For nearly 2,000 years, Babylon existed only as legend, a name in biblical texts, a faint memory in classical literature, a site marked by mysterious mounds in the Iraqi desert. The physical reality of Hammurabi's empire had vanished beneath sand and accumulated sediment, waiting for archaeology to reveal its secrets. The story of that rediscovery is itself remarkable, spanning centuries of exploration, excavation, and scholarly debate. European travelers had visited the ruins of Babylon sporadically since medieval times, though they usually had little idea what they were seeing. The mounds were impressive, clearly the remains of something significant, but without the ability to read cuneiform, without systematic excavation methods, visitors could only speculate. Some correctly identified the site as Babylon, others thought it might be Nineveh, or some other ancient city. Local Arabs had long used the ruins as a source of bricks, carrying away building materials for their own constructions, gradually diminishing what remained. The breakthrough came in the 19th century, with the decipherment of cuneiform script. This was a painstaking process, accomplished through the efforts of multiple scholars working with inscriptions from various sites. The Behistun inscription in Persia, carved by the Persian king Darius I in 3 languages, proved crucial. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer stationed in Persia, spent years copying this inscription from a cliff face, risking his life to reach the most inaccessible portions. His copies, combined with work by other scholars, eventually unlocked the mystery of cuneiform. Once cuneiform could be read, Suddenly, clay tablets. were not just artifacts but documents, letters, contracts, hymns, myths, administrative records. Every major excavation produced tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, each potentially containing new information. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and other European cities began acquiring cuneiform tablets, either through purchase or through supporting excavations, in exchange for a share of finds. Systematic excavation of Babylon began in the late 19th century. Robert Koldewey, a German archaeologist, led excavations from 1899 to 1917, the longest continuous archaeological excavation of ancient Mesopotamia ever undertaken. Koldewey's work focused primarily on the Neo-Babylonian period of Nebuchadnezzar II, when Babylon reached its greatest extent and splendor. He uncovered the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, massive city walls, temples, and palaces. But reaching the Old Babylonian levels from Hammurabi's time proved difficult. Babylon had been rebuilt repeatedly over its long history, with each rebuilding raising the ground level. Later buildings sat atop earlier ones, their weight compressing lower levels. Moreover, the water table had risen over millennia, flooding the deepest levels and making excavation dangerous and expensive. Kildare reached some Old Babylonian remains, but much remained inaccessible. The discovery of Hammurabi's law code did not occur at Babylon, but at Susa in southwestern Iran. French archaeologists excavating there in 1901 to 1902 found the famous diorite stela carried to Susa as war booty, probably by Elamite conquerors in the 12th century BCE. The stela's discovery caused international sensation. Here was physical proof of a king long known from biblical references and king lists, and here was one of the oldest law codes ever discovered. The stela was transported to Paris, where it remains in the Louvre, one of that museum's most prized possessions. Reading the code took time. While cuneiform could be read by 1901, understanding archaic Old Babylonian Akkadian required specialized expertise. Hired scholars worked through the text carefully, translating, debating interpretations, comparing similar provisions in other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Publications of the translated code began appearing in the early 1900s, and soon it was being studied in universities worldwide, influencing thinking about ancient law, society, and governance. Excavations at other Old Babylonian sites provided context for understanding Hammurabi's period. Marier, excavated by André Parrot, beginning in the 1930s, yielded the spectacular palace archive with its 25,000 tablets. These letters and administrative documents brought the diplomatic world of the Old Babylonian period to life, showing the complex relationships between kingdoms, the personalities of rulers, the challenges of governance. Hammurabi himself appeared in dozens of letters, sometimes as ally, sometimes as threat, always as a calculating political actor. Excavations at by Leonard Woolley, in the 1920s and 1930s, uncovered the famous royal cemetery, with its spectacular grave goods, but also revealed the city's continuous occupation through the Old Babylonian period. Tablets from Hammurabi's time were found, documenting his conquest and administration of the ancient Sumerian capital. The physical reality of its massive ziggurat, its residential quarters, its temples, provided tangible evidence of the cities Hammurabi had unified into his empire. Sippar, Larsa, Eshnunna, and other Old Babylonian sites have been excavated to varying degrees. Each excavation adds to our understanding. Sippar's archive of commercial and legal documents reveals economic life. Eshnunna's law code, predating Hammurabi's, shows legal evolution. Larsa's temples and palaces document the kingdom Hammurabi conquered. Slowly, through patient archaeology, the Old Babylonian world has emerged from obscurity. Modern techniques have revolutionized Mesopotamian archaeology. Aerial photography and satellite imagery reveal ancient settlement patterns invisible from ground level. Soil analysis determines ancient agricultural practices and environmental conditions. Radiocarbon dating and other scientific methods provide precise chronologies. Computer databases allow scholars worldwide to access and cross-reference thousands of cuneiform texts. Each advance brings new insights, yet enormous challenges remain. Political instability in Iraq has severely limited archaeological work for decades. The Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf Wars, and the chaos following the 2003 invasion all damaged sites and prevented research. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted in 2003, with thousands of artifacts stolen or destroyed. Archaeological sites were damaged by military operations or looted by antiquities thieves. Some of humanity's oldest cultural heritage was lost, damaged beyond repair, or scattered into private collections, where scholars cannot study it. Even in stable times, Excavating Mesopotamian sites presents difficulties. The mud brick architecture used throughout ancient Mesopotamia is difficult to excavate and interpret. Unlike stone buildings that retain clear outlines, mud brick structures erode into amorphous masses, requiring expert interpretation. Dating different building phases can be challenging. Distinguishing deliberate destruction from gradual abandonment requires careful analysis. Every excavation decision is difficult. Should you dig deeper, potentially destroying upper levels to reach older ones? Should you consolidate what you found, spending resources on preservation rather than new discovery? Ethical issues complicate matters further. Many of the world's great museums hold substantial collections of Mesopotamian artifacts, acquired during the colonial era, under circumstances that would be considered theft today. The Louvre's Law Stela, the British Museum's cuneiform tablets, Berlin's Ishtar Gate, all were taken from their countries of origin at times when local people had little say in the matter. Modern Iraq has repeatedly requested return of these artifacts, arguing they are national patrimony. Museums respond that they preserve and display these objects for global audiences, that they provide expert conservation, that returning items to unstable regions risks their loss or destruction. There are no easy answers to these questions. The artifacts are Iraqi heritage, created by ancestors of modern Iraqis, and arguably should be returned, but Iraq has faced decades of instability, and some returned artifacts have been damaged or lost. Perhaps shared custody might work, with objects rotating between Iraqi and foreign museums, allowing both preservation and connection to cultural heritage. But implementing such arrangements requires trust and resources currently lacking. Despite these challenges, scholarship on Hammurabi and the Old Babylonian period continues advancing. New excavations, when security permits, add to knowledge. Old excavation records are reanalyzed with modern techniques, yielding insights original excavators missed. Tablets in museum collections are studied, translated, and published. Digital humanities projects make texts and data widely available. Each year, our understanding grows more nuanced and complex. Recent scholarship has moved beyond viewing Hammurabi as a singular genius who created civilization. Instead, we now understand him as operating within long-established Mesopotamian traditions, adapting rather than inventing. His law code drew on earlier codes. His administrative systems built on centuries of practice. His religious policies continued established patterns. This contextualization doesn't diminish Hammurabi's achievement, but places it within the long arc of Mesopotamian civilization, showing how individual accomplishments rest on collective knowledge accumulated across generations. Archaeological methods themselves have changed dramatically. Early excavators sought spectacular finds, temples, palaces, art objects. Modern archaeology emphasizes context, understanding how artifacts relate to each other, what they reveal about social and economic systems, how they fit into broader patterns. A single cuneiform tablet recording a grain transaction might receive as much attention as a beautiful cylinder seal, because it provides data about economic life. Thousands of such mundane documents, analyzed collectively, reveal patterns invisible in any single text. Environmental archaeology has shown how human activity transformed the Mesopotamian landscape. The salinization of southern Mesopotamian soils, resulting from centuries of irrigation, is now understood as a major factor in the region's decline after Hammurabi. The deforestation of mountains to the north and east, providing timber for construction and fuel, altered drainage patterns and increased flooding. Ancient Mesopotamians were not living in harmony with nature, but actively transforming their environment, sometimes with catastrophic long-term consequences. The rediscovery of Hammurabi's world remains incomplete. Babylon's Old Babylonian levels remain largely unexcavated. Countless sites have never been dug, or were excavated poorly in early archaeology, before modern methods developed. Archives that could illuminate obscure periods probably still lie buried. Climate change, modern development, and continued political instability threaten sites before they can be properly documented. The race to preserve and understand is ongoing, with no clear end in sight. Yet what has been learned is remarkable. From scattered mounds and cryptic inscriptions, archaeology has reconstructed an entire civilization. Its political structures, economic systems, religious beliefs, daily practices, hopes and fears. Hammurabi has emerged from legend into history, no longer just a name in king lists, but a real person who lived, ruled, and left a lasting mark on human civilization. The clay tablets he and his contemporaries inscribed, meant for immediate practical purposes, have become our most direct connection to their world. voices speaking across 4 millennia, still legible, still informative, still relevant to our continuing quest to understand ourselves through understanding our past. Section 11 Word count. Approximately 1,850 words. Hammurabi died over 37 centuries ago, yet his influence continues reverberating through human civilization. Not through direct continuity. No institution he founded still exists. No kingdom he established survives. But through the ideas and practices his reign exemplified, through the model of governance he demonstrated, and through the specific text of his law code which has been studied, debated, and emulated across the millennia. To trace this influence is to follow one thread in the vast tapestry of human cultural evolution. The most direct influence was on subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. The Middle Assyrian laws, compiled several centuries after Hammurabi, show clear structural and substantive similarities to his code. The casuistic format, if a man does X, then Y shall be done, became standard for ancient Near Eastern legislation. Specific provisions sometimes closely parallel Hammurabi's laws, suggesting either direct borrowing or common legal traditions that Hammurabi had systematized and made canonical. The elevation of Marduk to supremacy in the Mesopotamian pantheon, begun under Hammurabi, continued for over 1,000 years. By the Neo-Babylonian period, Marduk was unquestionably supreme, the king of the gods, the creator of the world, the source of royal authority. The Enuma Elish, celebrating Marduk's victory over chaos, became the central myth of Babylonian religion, recited annually at the New Year festival. This religious transformation, linking political power to theological supremacy, would be replicated by other empires. The elevation of Ashur by the Assyrians, of Ahura Mazda by the Persians, later the transformation of Christianity from a persecuted sect to the official religion of Rome. Biblical law shows intriguing parallels with Hammurabi's code. The Book of Exodus contains the Covenant Code, including laws strikingly similar to Hammurabi's provisions. The famous lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, appears in Exodus 21:23, Neetes 25. Using almost identical language to Hammurabi's code, laws regarding slaves, personal injury, property damage, and family relations show similar patterns. The question of whether biblical law borrowed directly from Hammurabi, or whether both drew on common ancient Near Eastern legal traditions, remains debated. The evidence suggests indirect influence through cultural diffusion rather than direct borrowing. The Covenant Code may have been compiled in the 1st millennium BCE, over 1,000 years after Hammurabi, but it drew on Israelite legal traditions that had themselves been influenced by Mesopotamian civilization during periods of contact and conquest. When Judah fell to Babylon in 586 BCE, and its elite were exiled to Babylon, direct exposure to Mesopotamian legal traditions would have occurred. Whether earlier influence existed through trade, diplomacy, or cultural exchange is harder to determine, but seems likely. What makes these parallels significant is not proving specific borrowing, but recognizing common concerns about justice, order, and proper governance. Ancient Near Eastern societies shared similar social structures, slavery, class hierarchies, patriarchal family systems, and developed similar legal solutions to common problems. The fact that multiple civilizations independently concluded that reciprocal justice was appropriate for certain offenses suggests something about human moral intuitions, not just cultural borrowing. Greek and Roman writers mentioned Babylon, though their knowledge was often mixed with legend. Herodotus, visiting Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described its walls, temples, and customs, though with exaggerations and errors. Later classical writers generally portrayed Babylon as a symbol of ancient grandeur and decadence, a powerful civilization that had risen high and fallen hard. This mixed image, Babylon as both achievement and warning, persisted through medieval and early modern European thought. Biblical references to Babylon were complex and contradictory. The Tower of Babel story portrayed Babylonian ambition as leading to divine punishment and human fragmentation. The Babylonian captivity was remembered as a time of suffering and loss. Yet Babylon was also acknowledged as a great power, its conquests and magnificence recognized even by those who opposed it. This ambivalence, respect for power and achievement combined with moral critique, would characterize much subsequent thinking about empire. The rediscovery of Babylon in the 19th century came at a time when European empires dominated much of the world. Colonial powers saw themselves as heirs to ancient civilization, bringing order and progress to less developed peoples. The discovery that ancient Mesopotamia had developed sophisticated legal systems, complex bureaucracies, and advanced knowledge challenged simple narratives of Western uniqueness. Here was civilization arising independently, achieving sophistication millennia before Greece or Rome, yet ultimately failing and disappearing. The law code became particularly significant in late 19th and early 20th century legal scholarship. Some saw it as evidence that codified law was natural to human civilization, arising independently in multiple cultures. Others argued, showed ancient peoples possessed sophisticated moral reasoning and concern for justice. Still others noted its brutal punishments and class-based distinctions, using it as evidence that ancient societies were more primitive than modern ones. The code became a mirror, in which scholars saw reflections of their own assumptions about law, justice, and civilization. Educational use of the code spread widely. By the mid-20th century, the Code of Hammurabi was being taught in history classes around the world, usually as the first or one of the first law codes in human history. Though earlier codes have since been discovered, Hammurabi's remains the most famous, partly due to the impressive stela, partly due to the code's completeness and scope. Students still memorize eye for an eye and learn about Hammurabi the lawgiver, though often with limited understanding of actual Old Babylonian society. Modern legal scholars have debated Hammurabi's relevance to contemporary jurisprudence. Some argue ancient law codes like Hammurabi's represent fundamentally different approaches to law than modern Western legal systems, making comparison misleading. Ancient law was case-based rather than systematic, more concerned with preserving social hierarchy than protecting individual rights, embedded in religious frameworks that made no distinction between sacred and secular. Others argue that fundamental questions about justice, fairness, and the proper role of law remain constant across cultures and eras, making ancient codes like Hammurabi's relevant to ongoing debates. In popular culture, Babylon and Hammurabi have become shorthand for ancient civilization. Movies, novels, and video games frequently reference Babylon, usually with limited historical accuracy, but conveying a sense of ancient power and mysterious knowledge. Hammurabi appears in strategy games as a ruler players can choose, commanding Babylonian civilization. These popular representations, though simplified, keep Hammurabi's name alive in public consciousness, even if detailed knowledge is lacking. The administrative innovations Hammurabi refined had profound influence. The idea that effective governance requires systematic record-keeping, hierarchical bureaucracy, and specialized administrative functions is now universal. Every modern government, every large corporation, every complex institution uses these principles. We take them for granted, but they had to be developed, refined and transmitted across generations and civilizations. Hammurabi's reign represents an important stage in this development, demonstrating that military conquest alone could not sustain empire without administrative systems to consolidate control. The principle that laws should be public, written down, available for consultation, has also had lasting influence. Hammurabi's stela, displayed publicly with text explaining the king's laws, established a precedent that laws should not be secret, that people should be able to know what is prohibited and required. This principle, though frequently violated in practice, has become a foundation of modern legal systems. The rule of law, the idea that governance should follow established procedures rather than arbitrary will, traces back in part to ancient law codes, like Hammurabi's, that made law explicit and public. Yet we must be careful not to overstate Hammurabi's direct influence or project modern values onto ancient practices. Hammurabi was not a democrat or a humanitarian in any modern sense. His code protected hierarchy, not equality. It sanctioned slavery, not freedom. It was concerned with preserving social order, as he understood it, not with universal human rights. The code was propaganda as much as legislation, designed to glorify the king and legitimize his rule. The question then becomes, what can we legitimately learn from Hammurabi? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the complexity of human civilization. We cannot simply divide history into primitive and advanced, barbaric and civilized. Hammurabi's Babylon was sophisticated in some ways, its administration, its legal thought, its economic systems. It was brutal in others, its punishments, its inequalities, its treatment of conquered peoples. Understanding this complexity helps us recognize similar complexity in our own societies, to see that advancement in some areas can coexist with backwardness in others. Another lesson concerns the fragility of civilization. Hammurabi built an empire that seemed powerful and permanent, yet within a generation it was fragmenting, and within centuries the south had collapsed entirely. The administrative and economic systems that seemed so sophisticated were vulnerable to disruption. Irrigation systems required constant maintenance, when maintenance failed, civilization collapsed. This should give us pause as we confront our own vulnerabilities to climate change, economic disruption, social fragmentation. Our civilization seems powerful, but so did Hammurabi's. The archaeological rediscovery of Mesopotamia has given us unprecedented access to the ancient world, but it has also raised troubling questions about cultural heritage, colonialism, and who has the right to interpret the past. Hammurabi's stela sits in Paris, not Babylon. Countless artifacts are scattered across Western museums. Is this preservation or theft? Who speaks for the ancient Mesopotamians, modern Iraqis, as descendant population and territorial successor? International scholars, through their expertise, museums, through their role as custodians. These questions have no easy answers, but must be asked. As we stand in the early 21st century, looking back across nearly 4 millennia to Hammurabi's reign, what should we remember? Perhaps most fundamentally, we should remember that he was human, like us. He faced problems not entirely unlike our own: how to create order in a diverse society, how to balance power with justice, how to build institutions that will outlast us. He found partial solutions that worked for his time and circumstances. Those solutions are not directly applicable to our situation, but the attempt to find them, the struggle to create just and stable governance, remains deeply relevant. The ruins of Babylon still stand in the Iraqi desert, though damaged by time, war, and neglect. The Euphrates still flows past, though its course has shifted. The clay tablets inscribed in Hammurabi's time still exist in museums and archives, still waiting to reveal their secrets to patient scholars. And somewhere, perhaps still buried beneath sand and accumulated centuries, are tablets not yet found, archives not yet excavated, evidence that will further refine and complicate our understanding. Hammurabi ruled for 43 years, unified Mesopotamia briefly, compiled a law code that became famous, and died believing he had established an eternal kingdom. He was wrong about the kingdom. It fragmented almost immediately. But he was right about one thing: his name would be remembered, not because of military victories, which were transient, but because he articulated, however imperfectly, principles about law and justice that resonated across millennia. In attempting to create order from chaos, justice from power, and permanence from the flux of events, Hammurabi participated in a fundamentally human endeavor. That endeavor continues, and as long as it does, Hammurabi's legacy endures.